Through a high archway up a stone staircase, a man was dragging another by the collar of his clothes. The man's legs dragged painfully down the steps, and blood dripped from his body. The long-haired young man tossed his victim aside, standing in front of another man with a beard and his hair gathered into a bundle. The sight of the new adversary was very formidable. The defeated man fell at the feet of the menacing man, with his associates standing behind him. He replied to the comer that he was in too much of a hurry to be killed. The long-haired man only smirked. He called the bearded man the leader of the Little Bloodsnake sect, to which the head became enraged and activated his fighting technique. The irises of his eyes and fingertips began to sparkle with a golden glow. Bending his phalanges in his palms, he ran furiously at the intruder, shouting insults and curses. Just as he was about to grab the guy, he slipped out of his grasp at the last moment and was behind him. As soon as the man turned that way, the enemy was already there on the other side. They continued the battle, which was more like a cat-and-mouse game. The cult leader tried to catch the man with his fingers, and the man kept dodging. At one point in this whirlwind of two fighters, the leader managed to catch and cut off some of his enemy's hair and clothing, and slashed at his cheek, from which a drop of blood dripped, after which he made remarks to him that no matter how skillfully he dodged, he should never let his guard down before his opponent. While the young man was distracted by the cuts, the cult leader pressed his palms against his sides, and the man was thrown back against the wall. It's obvious now that your tricks are all you can do. Even if you've never heard of the Bloodsnake sect, you've lived a miserable life, incapable of more than just running away, the sect leader said triumphantly. He was about to deliver one last blow with two fingers, but the defeated man grabbed him sharply by them and squeezed them in his palm. But the man was able to push him away, which left his opponent confused, for such a fighting technique had no longer existed for 20 years. The head was indignant. "What could you possibly know?" he shouted. To which the young man replied that 20 years ago he had killed the last possessor of this technique. The leader was confused, and asked the long-haired man who he was. He looked at him with a sly smirk and then answered that he was a god of war named Mushin. The head of the sect laughed back and then took a serious look. He pounced again with his hand on his adversary, but the god slipped away, and the sect head struck the stone wall. He pounced again, unwilling to listen to the deception and delusion of the brazen man, wanting to kill him, and struck the ground with both hands. He struck Mushin with his fingertips, but he blocked the blow with his hands, deflecting the attack. Mushin had been dead for 20 years, and all that was left of him now was a skeleton in the ground. But even if the famous deity came back to life, he would not look like this weak man who can only do acrobatic tricks, the cult leader said. He kept hitting the man, and the man could no longer repel the blow, and tiredly fell to the floor, waiting for his death. The bearded man stood in front of the weakened man and uttered, "Whomsoever you serve, I will disperse my strongest members of the blood serpent cult, even if your patron is a woman or a child. I will kill everyone you know and dare to insinuate that you are the god Mushin." He concentrated his energy in his palm and was about to deliver the very last blow, but at that moment his hand was torn to pieces. At that moment the long-haired man raised his open palm above the level of his head, the inside of which bore the golden sign, the energy with which he had chopped his opponent's limb. The man stood up, his eyes sparkling with light and anger, and the sect leader collapsed from blood loss and pain, not understanding who stood before him. Mushin replied that nothing could save him from death, and he would be the first victim. The head gathered his last will and strength and swung again, but he was kicked in the face, which knocked him to the ground and hit his head, dying instantly. "The blood serpent is finished," Mushin said to the crowd watching. "If anyone disagrees, step forward." No one left the crowd, afraid of repeating the fate of their leader, and the god of war stepped out of the high archway with his next goal in mind. The sects and cults lived for many years without conflict. The swordmaster Song Wall led the righteous sects, the demon cultist Dan Gok led the wayward cults, and the peace between the two was maintained by Mushin, Muso Wall, who was in a neutral position between the two doctrines. But one day a son of Dan Gok named Dan Myung Woo was burned alive, and afterwards the corpse was beheaded. The cults were in turmoil and sensed impending turmoil. The head of the coalition and father of the dead young man, Dan Gok, was enraged. He decided to find the murderer of his child. His investigation revealed that the culprit was Baek Seo-moon, the leader of the sect. He couldn't be charged because of his status, and continued to pretend that Dan Myung-woo's death was an accident. But Baek Seo-moon himself didn't deny his guilt, remained silent, and even resented what was happening to disturb his peace. This dismissive attitude and lack of guilt fueled the anger of the father who buried his son. This led to imminent tragedy and serious conflict. The equilibrium in the whole country was upset, and a great war between cults and sects broke out, said the kind fellow who had accompanied Mushin. God chuckled and said that he only covered his eyelids for a moment, and that's how 20 years passed in an instant. Along the way, amidst the dense foliage of the forest, the young man shared with the god that across the state, all the organizations involved in the battle had suffered widespread losses, and in the battle between Sun Vol and Dan Gok, the sword of the former pierced the heart of the latter, and the strength of the coalition of sects immediately soared. Across the lands lay thousands of dead. When Dan Gok was killed, the cult coalition lost its powerful power and suffered a series of defeats. Eventually, the factions of the cultists were forced to flee to the ridge of thousands of great mountains, unable to withstand the pressure from the sects. Through this, a coalition of righteous Murim sects was able to gain control of 70% of all land in the country. The young man finished his account of the history of the past 2 decades, and then shared his thoughts, which implied doubts about the authenticity of all the events, since there were many holes and inconsistencies in the known facts. The fact is that the leader of Murim, Baek Seo-moon, disappeared shortly after the Great War began, and then returned after it ended. Also, the 2 guardians of Magyo, a sect of the martial arts world, disappeared at the same time and at the same time, and their disappearance remained mysterious. Then the guy continued, there was the sudden disappearance of Mushin, Mu So-wol. Over time, people came up with various versions of Mu So-wol-nim's disappearance. Some claimed that he had simply grown tired of the endless quarrels that dominated and retired. Others assured that he had become a Shinseon. At the last words, the man laughed, and although the young man argued that it is quite a logical theory, because to leave such a position in the world of martial arts and disappear for 20 years. Why are you back now? The young man asked. Mushin was surprised that the attendant realized that the missing god was standing in front of him, and complimented Un-hyun. He only replied that he had heard about the god of war before from Song-wol-nim before, so he was able to recognize it. I saw how easily you dealt with the blood serpent. You entered the sect, eliminating everyone by yourself, so your identity was obvious. Mushin asked Woon-hyun if he was interested in what he'd been missing for so many years, to which the guy loudly resented that whether he could possess the information that only the god of war possesses. I can see that you're just a rising star of Chongseong-pa, and he raised his voice at me. If you can repel one of my attacks, you will possess this information. I'll tell you, Mushin said with a sly look. He replied that he had heard the threat made by Song-wol-nim many times before, and that he wasn't afraid of the bet because he was nothing like his patron. Mushin replied that apparently Song-wol-nim hadn't told his apprentice what the god of war was truly capable of. The attendant overtook the god and walked hurriedly toward the city, saying that they were only a short distance away. So the fighting was in vain. It was better to move on. The blue sky was clear and clear. In front of the 2 travelers was a view of a village surrounded by a rich green dense forest. It was the Murim coalition. Will you go there now? Mushina Yoon-hyun asked. The need for a system designed to gather and educate rising stars for the sake of protecting the Murim sect from enemies was the reason for the coalition to create an academy called Cheon-so-dan. Un-hyun, sitting around a campfire in the evening, began to talk about the academy's rules for becoming an apprentice in order to get into the Murim coalition town. Anyone can become a member of the academy, but the exam can seem difficult if the participants are not endowed with natural talent and are not filled with power. The young man judiciously explained the steps and criteria, expressing his wish that Mushin be able to pass the test and become a member of Cheon-so-dan. For the sake of revenge, The god of war, along with his partner, should gather as much information as possible before revealing his identity, and so it was necessary to pretend to be recruits. They continued to talk about their plans and their fate, about what awaited them in Murim, which would entail hatred. They discussed Yun-hyun's resourcefulness and how he resembled his past mentor Song-wil, but still had a different character and was willing to follow Mushin to the end. The night passed and the day came. They went down to the gates of the coalition for the examination. Mushin came up with a new name for himself, Mu-young, and ordered his assistant to address him in public as his buddy. A crowd of people stood outside the main doors waiting for the event to begin. Mushin asked the boy if all these people were willing to take the exam. The young man replied that indeed many had gathered to get an introduction to the Murim coalition, which exists in Cheonso-dan, and not because of the purpose of founding the academy itself. However, less than 1% of all applicants usually make it to the final test. A local man approached them, whom the young man addressed by the name of Songbei Yang. He asked who the young man was who came with Yun-hyung, to which he replied that it was his friend Mu-young who wanted to enroll in Cheonso-dan, but he didn't belong to any sect because he was a self-taught practitioner, so he might not be familiar to many people. Yang So-gol, a former member of the Wanderer faction, said goodbye to the two travelers, wishing them good luck as this year's trials would be tougher than usual. The gate swung open and the two servants wheeled out a wagon in which a mysterious object, covered with a cloth, lay. A middle-aged man with a goatee stepped forward and thundered to the attention of all who had come to begin the examination. He greeted everyone and informed them that first, before the first round began, those who did not fit the students' criteria would be immediately eliminated, and this innovation was approved this year. There was indignation through the crowd, but it quickly subsided. The servants removed the cloth as ordered, and all could see that in the wagon lay a black stone in the shape of a rectangular parallelepiped. Mushin opened his eyes in surprise and told his friend that it was a stone of opposition. It looks like steel, but it is a stone filled with spiritual energy that increases its strength. An ordinary blow will not leave a single scratch on such a covering. The organizer asked the participants to strike the stone using martial arts and try to leave any marks and scratches. This would be an indication of their strength. But the mark must be at least an inch deep. If they fail to make a 1-inch mark, the contestants will have to go back home because they have not shown proper skill. One arrogant brave man said he could easily break this stone with his two-handed sword, but as soon as he struck, his blade broke in half and there was no mark on the cube. Mushin chuckled to himself. Looks like the Murim Academy of Cheonso-dan has decided to work on raising its standards. The next young man's sword also snapped, and the third man followed, only slashing his blade without a trace. The fourth swung his spiked club with all his might, but the stone remained perfectly smooth. The examiner began to sigh annoyingly that no strong contestants had come up so far. And then a young man with a stern, sharp gaze stood in front of the stone, and with one easy sword movement cut through the stone 3 inches, and then passed through the gate. The crowd was astonished, and Un-hyun did not recognize this strong fighter, nor from what lands and sect he might have come. Then Baek-gon, the grandson of the former sect leader, Baek-seo-moon, came to the test. The handsome, statuesque young man in white robes cut through 2.5 inches of granite. Un-hyun told Mushin that the appearance of one of Baek's kind was very strange in the Murim coalition. When Baek-seo-moon left his position as head, his son, Baek-chu-yang, succeeded him as sect leader, and nothing has changed since they announced their departure from the Murim alliance. After Baek-gong, his sisters Baek-ha-on and Baek-ah-young began to compete. Using an unusual weapon in the form of silver threads, the former was able to cut off the tip of a parallelepiped, which fell to the ground with a clatter, while the latter left a scratch the size of 1.5 inches. The Baek family walked proudly onto the academy grounds. Un-hyun watched them and said that the entry of all of Baek-seo-moon's grandchildren seemed a clear sign that Baek-chu-yang was eager to reunite with the coalition. Mushin countered this theory, saying that such a goal was too obvious because a sect leader who had left the alliance would not have sent all of his children to Cheon-so-dan just to restore relations and reunify the organizations. Yun Hyun met his gaze with the departing Baek Ah-young, and blushed with embarrassment when he saw her grace and beauty. Mushin looked at his friend perplexedly, and then made his way to the stone as it was his turn. A wave of whispers passed through the crowd of those watching. What a ragamuffin in gray rags with no weapons had come to become an apprentice. It was ridiculous. But the god of war didn't need weapons. His very body was like armored steel. He flexed his muscles and pressed his fist into the shiny granite, leaving a deep imprint of his hand on it. Everyone was shocked, and the young man went to the gate to pass the next stage. At the entrance to the main court, those who had passed the entrance test stood waiting for the first stage of the exam itself. They looked at each other sideways, pondering who was each other's enemy and who was each other's friend. Many looked in Mushin's direction, and Yun Hyun made the comment that he was drawing too much attention by working at the melee, though it might have been even scarier if he'd had a weapon in his hands. The god of war turned his attention to the stare directed at him. It was a young girl with brown hair and brown eyes who looked at him very seriously, and then she defiantly turned the other way. Brother and Sister Baek looked haughtily in the direction of their friends, and laughed at Mushin, believing that he was not at all skilled in weapons and any techniques, and got here only through brute strength. They pondered over who was the strongest, and whether there were those who could hide their abilities and break the stone with less strength. Baek Ha-on looked at the stranger, who was the first to scratch the stone, leaving a 3-inch mark, and thought he was handsome, to which her brother just said that his sister only looks at appearances. Now in time, the third of Baek's grandchildren stood quietly behind her elders and did not speak a word. She was in her thoughts, remembering her father's words. The strength of the coalition is growing day by day, but our Baek Wol Moon sect is going the opposite way. Therefore, we must renew our relationship with the coalition in order to promote our growth. Ah-young, follow your brother and sister and join Cheon So-dan together. Become a bridge between the coalition and Baek Wol Moon, he said to his daughter before she left. Eun-hyun glared at the girl again, not listening to his comrade. When at that moment the participants were called by the organizer to go through the first stage, everyone moved to the platform, and his partner escorted his friend off, wishing him good luck in the upcoming bout. The head of Cheon So-dan, known as Iron Law Lee Kyung, stood in front of them and began to explain the rules. The fighters were surprised that the head of the academy himself came to test them. Iron Law head Lee Kyung is a true legend, having slain countless demon cultivators with one blade. Voices here and there said, expressing their admiration. The test you are about to take is different from the one you took to qualify for the exam. The man spoke loudly and clearly. In other words, the level of difficulty is even higher. However, if you have diligently honed your martial arts, you will definitely make it to the final part of the exam. Just as hopeful as you are, I look forward to seeing what this exam will bring out in you. So the first test is called the test of the 5 senses. While everyone was digesting the information, a grenade with a lit fuse was thrown into the crowd. After the explosion, thick puffs of smoke enveloped the whole place, and then several more of these bombs were thrown. Coughing, the fighters began to look around, holding their weapons tighter in their hands and waiting for the enemy on either side. But their guard was down, their vision failing them, and many were caught by the soldiers, with wooden sticks in their hands and dressed in black robes hiding their faces. The ninjas would hit the examinees so that they would lose consciousness, and then throw a red card over their bodies, signifying that they were out of the test. Mushin watched the elusive one's every move and waited for an attack. The ninjas continued to strike at the contestants, throwing them off the challenge. Baek Gong and Baek Ha-on were standing back to back, peering at their opponents, and they didn't notice how they lost their sister. They thought the test was to see how long they could repel their attackers, and until the smoke cleared. A warrior attacked them from behind, and Baek Gong at the last moment repelled the blow of a wooden sword and cut him in two, for which he received praise from his sister. As the weapons collided, the young man sensed that these wooden swords were filled with chi energy, and could be far more dangerous than previously thought, as the mercenaries wielding them were familiar with spiritual energy and well trained for combat. On the ground lay dozens of the defeated, some of them unconscious in their own blood. Mushin stared at them, not looking around. Towards him behind his back ran swiftly Da enigmatic shaggy-haired girl. Leaping behind her, she raised her sword above her, and right in front of the guy she chopped the wooden stick of her attacker, while he continued to stand calmly, as if anticipating that he would have his back. The girl looked into her opponent's eyes and remembered the way she had gone to find him. I cannot give you the answers you seek. However, I do know someone who can. Right now, that person is on his way to the Murim coalition with Hyun. The elder told the girl before she moved on to join the ranks of the academy. Finally, she asked the name of the person she was looking for answers to her questions, and the older man told her to look for Mu Young. Now that this man was standing in front of her, she told him that if he continued to stand so relaxed without doing anything, he would not pass the exam, and she ran off into the fog. The young man looked after her, and without turning back quickly grabbed the other assailant's wooden sword with a swift movement of his hand and broke it, squeezing it in his hand, causing the ninja to be shocked and run away in fear. The warrior, who had surrendered his clearance with a score of 3 inches, deftly parried the soldier's attacks and was able to strike his opponent, making a deep cut on his shoulder, from which blood began to flow. The ninja did not expect any of the newcomers to be able to hit one of them, and after commenting on the examiner's attack with the word superb, went into the fog. The first ones who were able to do damage deeper than 1 inch on the stone did well on the first test of the exam. Those watching from the rooftops of the walls surrounding the site came to the head of the academy with a report, and reported that among the participants, including those who escaped the smoke and left the courtyard, 30% had been defeated and marked death. Lee Kyung ordered the elimination of 50%, expressing his desire to, quote, "Carrying a sword that will eventually break is only a burden." This meant that students who could pass the first stage with a 30% exclusion could fail the next test. So to make it quicker and easier, more people could be excluded and leave the more able ones, leaving the exclusions up to 50%. Night fell. At the house of the head of the academy, the master was arguing with a man. Lee Kyung criticized his comrade for secretly interfering in the trial by pretending to be an assassin. He justified himself by saying that when he heard that this time there were really unique and outstanding newcomers fighting, he couldn't contain his curiosity. The friends sat down on the floor at a table and decided to drink a bottle of wine together, sharing with each other their impressions of the participants. Among them were indeed those who aroused genuine interest and were able to surprise the head of the academy. With such warriors, the Murim coalition hopes to create a new Dan, a special group. At first, the examiners feared there would be no one qualified to pass this highest difficulty exam, but now they could breathe easy, for the sect's plan remains in effect. They would now be able to recreate Yan Qian Dan, a group of dragons whose work would be different from what Qian So Dan is accustomed to. In the meantime, all the recruits settled into the dormitory. They were getting to know each other and resting as they prepared for the next test. Baek Ha-on complained to her brother about being fed horrible food and being housed in old dilapidated housing. The brother only replied, giving in to everyone else that they were so tired that they didn't want to think about such things. And furthermore, they weren't guests here. Their younger sister Ah Young stood at a distance talking to Mushin. She thanked him for his help during the ordeal, expressing her respect because if he hadn't arrived at the last minute, she wouldn't have been able to pass the first stage. The young man denied it, answering that she would have made it on her own. Her brother and sister looked at her haughtily, muttering that she was being humiliated. Gon asked his sister what had happened on the playground, and the girl began to tell him. It happened at the moment when, once again, you disappeared into the smoke while you were fighting. When I realized I was alone, I lengthened my thread and started spinning it in a circle. All my attention was focused on building a field to block all the attacker's attacks at once. But one managed to calculate the speed of the spinning and managed to stop the thread by wrapping it around his sword. While I started to take it away, 2 of them ran directly towards me, and I already thought that I had failed the test, when suddenly their blows were blocked by Mu Young's leg, and then he admonished my technique that I should be faster and more cunning when lengthening the thread. Then Ah Young came up and said that she would take care of this side of the attack, and I should watch the other side. The three of us stood with our backs to each other and were able to fend off several attacks. The female warrior finished her story. She remarked that this young self-taught practitioner was very clever and attentive, and should not be underestimated. Meanwhile, two young boys approached the holder of the highest grade on the clearance exam. They said that the only reason they chose to enter was because of him, because the young warrior is an example to them. They introduced themselves as Jang Hyuk and Jang Hyun, and they were smiling twins. The warrior responded to them with the same kindness, and happily introduced himself by the name Lee Bom. After talking about the day, everyone went to bed. Mushin quietly left the barracks and went to a hillside. Sitting on a rock, he began to look at the stars. He said into the void that even here he was prevented from enjoying his solitude, and asked a hidden stranger to come out into the light. It was this brown-haired woman who began to assure him that she had not been following the young man, but was just walking her way, and when she heard the noise she decided to hide. She asked him how he knew she was standing behind, to which the god of war replied that she had fallen for the ruse herself. He had only spoken his thoughts aloud. He cited the metaphor of a frog jumping out at the noise of a thrown rock, and the girl took offense at the comparison of her to an amphibian. She said her name, Han So-jin, and asked her interlocutor's name. The next day came. Everyone gathered in the house where the second stage of the exam was to be held. The participants were seated on cushions on the floor, and the examiner, Ju Ge-yong, came in. He was an elderly man with a thin beard, dressed in rich clothes according to his status, and wearing a traditional headdress. He noticed that the prospective students looked tired, as many of them had not slept well because of the uncomfortability of the dilapidated bedrooms. Many had bruises under their eyes, and some were yawning. The leader told his assistants to bring the necessary preparations. He said they needed to cheer up and replenish their strength for the next stage, since every fighter was entitled to a breather between fights. The girls brought small cups of green, delicious-smelling beverage on trays. It was Lunjing green tea. According to the men, this kind of tea purifies the body and strengthens the blood vessels, and on top of that, the taste and aroma, even its color, make it delicious. The participants grabbed their stacks and drained them with gusto. When Ah Young put the cup to her lips, Mu Young, who was sitting next to her, told her only to pretend to drink the tea but not to really drink it, and then briefly explained that there was probably something slipped into the drinks. She heeded the advice. Those seated in the hall marveled at the taste and aroma, and after finishing their meal began to listen to the explanation of the next challenge. In front of them were placed boxes with cells containing various herbs, fruits, vegetables, berries, roots, mushrooms, and bottles of substances. In front of you there are various mixtures of ordinary plants, as well as expensive herbs that are very rare to find. Ju Ge-yong began his explanations. You can use all these herbs and potions to make the antidote you need for the poison you have all drunk now. The listeners looked surprised, and already some of them were coughing up blood on such short notice. The examiner, before he left, said one last time that this test was to evaluate their performance in a critical situation, and that they would be able to neutralize the poison instantly in the wilderness, and on errands where there might be traitors who wanted to poison. The longer participants fail to create an antidote, the more severe the symptoms will be, namely bleeding from the mouth, weakness of the whole body, and a clouded mind. If any of them want to give up and leave the test, they can go out the doors, where the examiner will give them their antidote, and they will be disqualified. The doors closed, and the students, through their pain, began to complain to each other that even if they knew the recipe, how could they make it while squirming and coughing up blood? Ah Young asked Mu Young how he could know that there was poison in the tea, and why he decided to help her. The young man replied that he helped her so that she could help everyone else, because they had talked about it earlier. Apparently, the previous night he had asked her what other skills she possessed besides fighting with silver thread. She replied that her specialty was herbs and potions. It turns out he prompted her so that now she could identify poison and prepare an antidote for everyone else. She also told Mushin after the last battle that if he needed help, she could turn to her, though she had little faith that she could one day be of use to him. He said that although there were too many kinds of poisons, The most basic ones were only 5. She covered her mouth with the sleeve of her clothes and leaned over one patient to determine the symptoms. His body became cold and he was bleeding, since she herself did not show these symptoms, so this poison only works when consumed internally. Lunging tea has a richer color and aroma than the others, which means that the poison itself also had a strong color and odor that needed to be masked with another fragrant drink. And since the Murim Coalition does not keep deadly poisons, putting everything together, it turns out that it is most likely either blood-dispersing poison or snake venom. Mushin named the names of the poisons for the girl, and she was amazed at his knowledge, and at the fact that he too was not steeped in this field, and could do everything himself, but apparently wanted the girl not to be shy and prove herself on this test. The girl began to say that the difference between the 2 poisons was hard to tell, but the antidotes were completely different, and if you made the wrong one, you wouldn't be able to save anyone. Mu Young replied that the difference was simple. It is whether or not there is resistance inside the dantian, the place where the life force chi is stored. He also added that this poison caused no resistance from his dantian, and he showed the drained cup of tea. It turns out he drank the decoction, but it didn't make him feel bad like the others. What was wrong with this guy? The girl was very surprised, but she didn't ask questions. Han Sojin watched them bleed and noticed that Mu Young drank the poison along with everyone else. But he didn't show any symptoms. Could he really be immune to poisons? Was that even possible? The girl intended to uncover all the secrets of this strange type. High above the houses of the Murim Coalition territory on a hill, watching from above down stood the man with whom the head of the academy had been drinking wine the previous evening. He was reflecting on the last part of their dialogue. As you already know, there are too many practitioners in Cheonso-dan. How can we get stronger just by increasing the number of warriors? The head spoke. But if the group included the ones you spotted, then our strength would increase. It's time for Yan Cheondan's creation. Zhuge Yun, the current examiner, came up to him and told the man that, looking at his pensive face, it didn't look like he was waiting for the results of the exam. The exam went well. Most of all, the participants were able to pass and heal. But the credit for the overall team was solely to Ah Yong, who demanded that everyone else also did well. But if not for her, no one would have passed the test. Her older sister Baek Ha-on complained to her brother why everyone kept praising Ah Young just for doing the usual anti-nuclear. The girl despised her own sister and thought she was better than her, and her rival's success made her very angry. However, her older brother put her in her place, saying that it was extremely low to speak out, considering that the girl herself had drunk the potion prepared by her sister, and passed the further stage only thanks to her. Meanwhile, the savior shyly accepted praise from the other contestants, replying that her merit was extremely small and her abilities small. Mushin watched from afar, leaning against the wall, and there was pride in his eyes for the girl. The man continued to discuss the examination with Zhuge Yong standing on the hill. You confused them by slipping snake poison, but they were able to understand. Few people can tell the difference between blood-dispersing poison and snake venom, said the observer. That's what I'm talking about. After the test was over, I came in with the antidote, but was met with their stares. I felt as if I had been hit on the head. The man replied that the head of Li Gaiam would be made even more confident and determined by this news to reconstitute a new group of Yan Cheondan warriors. The examiner asked teacher Zhuge what he thought of this plan, but the man's answer was tentative and unconfirming. Given the current state of the coalition, he himself wasn't against creating a new group. Maybe it would actually do some good. But even if he was against it, nothing would stop Li Jiam from his intended goal, especially if he was convinced that the current set of fighters matched the abilities of the warriors who should be in Yan Cheondan's lineup. The man dejectedly replied that the examiner also supported the idea, but the man reasoned that they all still needed to think hard and observe. But in any case, it was all too obvious that the influence of the future Yan Cheondan would be many times greater than that of the current Cheonso-dan. This was certainly true, the observer reasoned, for while Cheonso-dan was a shield, Yan Cheondan was a sword, and a double-edged one at that. Often the best remedy for an infection left on the flesh is to cut it out. I thought the whole process would be painful, filled with blood and tears, but it's much better than ignoring it at the risk of life, Zhuge said. After the conversation was over, one of his subordinates came up the hill to inform them that Sir Zhuge was already waiting for the second test. The man departed, lastly telling his comrade that Li Guillaume wanted Do One to become the head of Yanqiandan, and he himself personally thought that the only one worthy of it was none other than him. Then he turned and asked the man a question. No matter what others say, isn't your doctor's word important enough, Do One? The observer was Do One. He was the one they wanted to put in charge of the new coalition organization, but he himself was still of the opinion that the plan was too crude, and that forming the group was a rash decision. All the participants walked along the path past the foliage of the trees, which sheltered them from the scorching sun, to the second part of the test of the second phase of the general examination. They weren't sure that they were completely cured of the poison, and still strong enough to go on with the exam. They felt as if they were about to be killed or driven to the hospital by all the torture and torment. The boys and girls walked all the way, continuing to argue with their attendants and voice their displeasure. A member of the academy informed them that the examiner had arrived, and now they too could pass on. Each student went through a door, with a canopy in the form of a traditional roof, and found themselves inside a dark and deep cave, with a huge staircase descending inside. They were told that it was very dark inside and the steps were steep, so they had to go down very carefully, taking their time. They went down and found themselves in a training area, windowless, underground. The space, lined with concrete slabs, was lit by small floor candles. The students were amazed, and noted with respect the fact that the masons had gone to great pains to create such a place. Mr. Zhuge came up to them and said that this place was called the Subterranean Training Catacombs, and there were many other rooms besides this one. The training rooms are places where practitioners look for ways to cultivate with special techniques, but the passageways connecting these rooms form a maze. There are even some among new members who, upon entering for the first time, get lost and cannot go back. And therein lay the next task. The second part of the second phase of the test of understanding, would take place in real underground catacombs. The test was very simple in theory. Each participant simply had to find their way out of the labyrinth for half an hour. If they could not find their way out within that time, they would be given a death sign. The examiner wished everyone successful completion of the task, and said he hoped that everyone would be able to get out of the labyrinth and meet him on the surface. While the students listened to the man, Han Sojin looked intently at Mu Young. The examiner withdrew into the depths of the labyrinth, long knowing by heart the exit to the outside before any of the participants could follow his trajectory. As they waited their turn to enter the maze, they began to complain about the new challenge. I knew it. I can't believe they put us in a place where we can walk in circles. After all, he had an ulterior motive. Came the disgruntled exclamations here and there in the crowd. All right, let's all calm down, for in this round I'll save everybody, said one brave man, confident in his abilities. You see, I remembered perfectly the way we were going. It seems that this time we can pass the test without any problems. Someone actually believed him, and marveled at how many people were gathered here with such amazing abilities, and then asked that participant to stand in front and lead them forward through the maze. One of the disciples, walking behind the crowd, said he would treat everyone to food after they finished the challenge. Ha-an told his brother that they should follow the others, but his brother replied that they would all only get lost following that upstart. A small group of people were left in place, including the strongest, those who had received the highest clearance scores, and the mysterious guy in red clothes and with bangs hiding his eyes. No one had been paying attention to him until that moment, but he touched the wall and said the following. I feel a slight vibration and sound coming from the walls all the time. This certainly means that the underground training catacombs are a continually moving machine. Ever since we went downstairs, everything around us has started to vibrate. Li Bam asked him how he could figure it out. The young man replied that he was from the barrier sect, and similar machines, including this one, had been developed in his organization. Mushin said the boy was right, but this machine wasn't the only problem. He could feel the sweet smell he had noticed earlier intensifying. Han Seo-jin also smelled it, and he didn't understand who or what it might belong to. The other participants also began to smell the sweet scent and looked around. Could it be? All the underground catacombs were beginning to fill with poison. There was no doubt about it. Throughout the labyrinth spread the smell of poison, which had an effect on the body and made it difficult to find the right exit in such a short time. All participants had to overcome weakness, and yet remain very attentive in order to make sense of the tangled corridors of the dark dungeon. Logically, since the purpose of the task was to find a way out, the poison should not have been deadly or soporific, for everyone continued to stand awake, even though they had inhaled the fumes from the moment they descended into the catacombs. The twins began to say that they were already feeling symptoms in the form of dizziness, but Ah Young said that she had not yet voiced the supposed symptoms because she was an expert on poisons. Li Bam said that the longer they were in there, the harder it would be for them to get out. Mushin asked the young man from the barrier sect what his name was, and he replied that his name was Wu Young Sob. The god of war then asked if Young Sob could find his way out, but he said that even though he knew how the mechanism worked, he still needed to find out which way it moved. But it was so dark all around that it was no different from blindness, and he wouldn't be able to manage even in an hour. However, if the others banded together and became his extra ears and eyes, they had a chance. The remaining contestants agreed to help, since it was to their advantage as well, since everyone wanted to pass the test successfully. And since it was necessary to cooperate and teamwork to win, everyone forgot about the rivalry and began to work. All of them had to find various cracks in the walls, on the floor, and on the ceiling, which could look like unnatural ones, distinctive from the joints of concrete slabs. It was behind such cracks that the passageways to the mechanism were located, and one could understand the trajectory of the changing corridors. Wu Young Sob led everyone forward. Mushin noticed that Han So-jin wasn't beside them, though she was initially standing beside them when they first smelled it. He stealthily separated himself from the crowd and went down the other corridors looking for the girl. He was called by Ah Young, but he told her to go without him and he would catch up with her soon. The girl said okay and went after the others. Mu Young began to walk down the stairs. Looking near the exit doesn't make sense. If my memory serves me right, these are fragrant snake jaws. When their comrades were injured, nomads from the northern regions used it as a painkiller, and in very small quantities, the god pondered. Before going to the surface, Mr. Zhug said into the empty darkness, knowing that the participants would not hear him, but they had already realized that they were inhaling poison. If you continue to inhale the toxin, you will know how the poison got its name. Poisoned by the sweet aroma, you will eventually fall into the snake's mouth. It will completely consume your mind. In the crevices of the corridors were placed pouches from which the very scent emanated. Mushin lowered his breathing rate as much as he could to slow the symptoms of poisoning, but as he thought, it was useless. This poison, even with just a little inhalation, showed before his eyes the fear and pain hidden deep within people. The poison did not put him to sleep, paralyze him, or make him sick. It was hallucinogenic. The corridor in front of Mushin began to burn bright red, even resembling blood with light. He was trapped in an illusion that was reproduced by his own dark and traumatic memories from the past. It was as if he sank into scarlet space, and then was transported back several years. Gray tattered clothes replaced his pants and bandages on his arms. His chest was bare and his fists radiated a golden glow from the accumulated and concentrated power of his chi. Our brothers' spilled blood will only unite us. We will become stronger with the blood of our enemies, and today I will become a god with the blood of Mushin, said the warlord in his red cloak, and with eyes burning with anger, standing on a pedestal above his army. Mushin stood before the army, waiting for the traitors to attack. The scraps of memory from 20 years ago about the beginning of the war of sects and cults surfaced before him. He was telling them that this was far from over, and none of them would survive until tomorrow, even if there is a god among them. The traitor demanded of his subordinates that they get him the heart of Mushin, and the soldiers pounced on the man. He raised his fist upward and removed several men with a shockwave. The ground beneath his force crumbled and rocks scattered in different directions. He began to keep count, and began with the number 9. then struck another blow at the troops without touching, and counted 10, then hit the ground, and some more soldiers fell unconscious. He uttered 11, and on the number 12 jumped up to the commander-in-chief standing on a high platform. Overcoming the great distance with a single thrust in the air, he clashed in a duel with the enemy. Burning golden eyes stared into angry red ones, the former in a beastly grimace and the latter smiling a cold-blooded smirk. Mu Young woke up sitting in a lotus pose on the cold floor. Of all the memories, it showed me the one where I experienced the most physical pain. If I could not withstand the effects of the poison, no one can. Han Seo-jin, and this child too. I must hurry to find her, he said to himself. Through a great effort, he stood up and moved forward. Meanwhile, the girl too was in a world of her own memories. Kiki, crazy bitch. How could she abandon her child and follow her husband? What a misfortune. She was such a charming beauty. I wanted to play with her for a while. Kiki. Sounded a squeaky laugh in the darkness. So Jean was a little crying girl who was looking at a hanged man whose legs had been ripped off the ground. A man's hand grabbed her face and he asked what to do with her. The other replied that she could be like her mother so they could raise her themselves. All this was going on in her head, but in reality the girl was cornered and grabbing her head. In the horror of the morally traumatic memories, she whispered that she would kill those scoundrels. Every last one of them. From the entrance of the cave, no one had yet returned. Master Zhuge became worried about the participants and asked his subordinate how much time was left. He looked at the candle, of which there was only a quarter left, and replied that there was not much time left. If it ends like this, Du Wan and Li Qiang will be very disappointed, thought the examiner. At that moment, the aide asked him to pay attention to the passage. Students began to come out of it. They were very weak and exhausted from the effects of the poison, with sweat dripping from their foreheads in streams and their faces looking tired. The chief ordered that they be taken to a comfortable place and given water, so that they could quench their thirst. Ah Young was leaving the place worried about Mu Young, who never caught up with them as she turned back, hoping to see him walk out the door. The older sister noticed this, and arrogantly said, "How dare you worry about someone else when you can't even handle the effects of the poison yourself, being nothing but a burden to my brother and me. If you want to prove that you can do something on your own, first take care of yourself and stop being so insignificant in other people's eyes." And Yong remained silent. Her self-esteem was once again trampled in the mud and made guilty. No one thought she was insignificant except her own family. All the other contestants thought she was their rival, who was even better than them in some ways, and especially kindly treated Mu Young. So where is he now? Now that I think about it, that man is not among them. The aura radiating from that man was very unusual. I thought he would come first. Sir Jug pondered about Mu Young. There was not much time left, but the examiner did not give up his expectations and waited for the talented contestant until the very end. Meanwhile, in the depths of the dungeon, Mushin jumped to the very bottom, thus shortening the time to avoid going down the long spiral staircase. Ignoring the hallucinations that appeared with each breath, he walked down the corridor. One of the participants reached the point of insanity, and while harping that he hadn't killed anyone, apparently in his flashback someone accused him of murder, he attacked the young man by picking up a large rock from the floor. He swung to hit him in the head, but Mushin stopped him with a single movement of his palm, which he set against his attacker with a rib. He fell unconscious. It was the same braggart who, at the beginning of the ordeal, said he knew the way and led part of the team after him. Everyone who followed him was just as distraught and wandered through the corridors of the labyrinth, completely oblivious to the goal of finding a way out. Mushin found Sojin walking along the wall, running her palm over it with her head down. Everyone wanders around like madmen trapped in their own subconscious, like the Walking Dead. But you, how do you still look so good? What's your secret? She spoke. Sweat appeared on her face, her eyes radiated misery, and every step was difficult. She started repeating the question of who Mu Young was after all, and took a step in his direction and began to fall. The man picked her up in time to lift her up in his arms, and told her that this was not the time to talk about his identity. They needed to get out into the fresh air as soon as possible. He ran forward, talking to himself in thought. answering her own question that it didn't matter at all who he was, or what path he was taking to get back at the Murim coalition. He had spent too much time searching for her, and finding a way out in the time he had left was quite impossible. But the point of the assignment was to get to the surface in a certain amount of time, and until it was over, he could go on the sly without thereby breaking the rules he had announced. Do-Won was sitting on a boulder near the back wall of the labyrinth, throwing small pebbles at it as he waited for the second stage of the exam to end. He was still pondering that he doubted that forming a new group was the only solution to curing the coalition of the rotten flesh the new warriors would have to carve. He needed some assurance that no matter what variables might arise, they could move forward boldly. The wall began to shake, and there was a muffled noise that grew into a rumbling noise. Cracks began to form in the white bricks, and the next moment a huge hole was gaping, and the slabs were crumbling into stones. Mu Young, holding Sojin in his arms, broke through the wall to get out in the allotted time. Do-Won was shocked that this kid could break such a thick, solid wall. Evening came. A meeting of elders began in one of the main buildings of the academy, before whom Zhuge-Yong was giving a report on the past test. At the discussion of the formation of Yongqiandan, it was decided that it was not feasible, and so one of the elders was unclear why Zhuge suddenly brought up the matter. He apologized for correcting his lord's words, but the question was not put as unfeasible, but as requiring a more thorough discussion. Another elder, hidden in the shadows like all the others seated in the chairs, asked if there had been any changes as far as Yongqiandan was concerned. The examiner replied in the negative, and then the elder went on to say that the Murim coalition's internal inspection. Sir Zhuge says that the inspection might pose a threat to the Murim coalition. The first sage interrupted him. Zhuge responded that the strength of the coalition had grown since the beginning of the Great War between sects and cults, and through its many connections and relationships with other forces, its influence had expanded. However, the reality is that the coalition has yet to fully investigate the activities of these groups. This is how he originally wanted to respond. All 8 wise men began to argue. If it weren't for our connections, how would we have grown this way? Said some. We shouldn't try to do things that don't even bode well, said 2. We will only induce antipathy toward us by exploring inaccessible areas, said a third. Nothing seemed to take the heads to the side about creating a plan for a new group of warriors to provide internal security for the coalition in cooperation with other organizations. They went on to argue that if Murim were to sow mistrust over the formation of this new group and end up with a divided group from within, would Zhuge in that case be able to take full responsibility, or would someone else? The teacher replied that he understood all of the elders' concerns, and then began to explain that having achieved the goal with the help of Yongqiandan, and if the group were to find and resolve issues within the coalition impartially. He was interrupted by one of the men, stating that he was not talking about experienced warriors, for which Zhuge could indeed vouch, but about a group of practitioners who were barely over 20 years old. The examiner replied that the students were all obedient, and the fact that they were so experienced and competent at such a young age suggested that they could successfully steer their further development in the right direction, making them a level head above all other soldiers. Afterwards, the audience asked the speaker who the leader of the group would be, and the speaker replied that Do-Won was the most suitable for the leadership role. If we're talking about the coalition experience, he's one of those who led Xian Sodan along with its leader Li Qiang. But he's a little strange. Sage asked, are they the most talented people ever to take the exams? There is no place in the coalition where this story is not known, said a man dressed in golden robes who came in. It was the leader of the coalition Nim, a bald old man with a white beard, a large gold amulet hung around his neck. He was the one who spoke the final verdict at the meetings. Zhuge greeted the leader and he told him that he had heard that the Masons had a sudden additional job. The examiner began to apologize and explain that it was due to his own negligence because one of the test participants had broken through a wall to get out of the catacombs. Do-Won stood outside the building, leaning his body against a tree trunk, and waited for Zhuge Yun to escort all the elders out of the assembly hall. After bowing to them one last time, the man approached his comrade. They walked with him to a small house to discuss what had happened. They want the members to confront the special fighters. The idea is for them to gain experience, ensuring that each of them will be able to think intelligently and logically, regardless of their talents. So it's more of a training session than an exam, Yoon told them. What they meant by that was that even if the group was formed, they wouldn't officially support it, Do-won said. The elders couldn't support the group even if they wanted to. When young Kyeon-dan started his investigations, there would be a conflict between the coalitions and the other forces. What do you think will happen if the coalition leader himself comes forward and supports young Kyeon-dan? Serjuge asked. Do-won didn't answer that question, saying that the elders had done all they could. They went outside. The examiner began to comfort his friend by saying that, as it were, they had overcome most of the obstacles, and now they had only one task left, and that was to come up with a new exam. If his results are good, they can begin work immediately. Do-won apologized that he couldn't be of any help right now, but Zhug reassured the man by answering that if he hadn't agreed to become the leader of the new group, he wouldn't have called the elders and said anything to them. It was only because Do-won said he was willing to bear his sword that the teacher overcame his fear of the elders and spoke out. So all of today's success was entirely due to the future head of Yan Cheon-dan, who was able to instill confidence in his colleague, although he thought that one would need much more time to think about the proposal. The warrior said that he really had doubts and was about to give up. But at the last moment, after thinking of the countless paths that could be taken, he realized that he didn't have to look for a way when there was one who would build it for his leader. He realized that he didn't need a reason why he couldn't do it himself. A picture appeared before his eyes of an event that had happened during the day. As the clouds of dust from the ruined wall descended, and he saw Mu Young holding Sojin in his arms, he realized in that very instant that he agreed to become the leader of the new group. Mushin's determined and stern eyes showed by his appearance that the man had a clear goal and a path to follow. He exuded confidence and strength, and so Do-won was no longer worried that he might do something wrong if he had such a man in his squad. Lee Kyung ran up to them and reported that there had been an incident in the underground library. Seojin was once again sitting on that rock in the forest under the starry sky, and she hugged her knees dejectedly. Mushin came up to her and said that if she really wanted to rest in a place like this, she would not have left the restroom and come all the way here. But if she wanted to thank him for his help in this way, knowing that he was coming here, then regardless of the location, she was a little late. She told him to back off unless he was going to tell her who he really was. The man sighed, not understanding such curiosity, and then the girl told him that she had been sent here by a swordsman named Song-wol, who had directed her to a man called Mu Young to give her the answers to all the questions she was looking for. I saw it then. If you really tried, your power is great enough to defeat the Marim coalition alone. I couldn't reach that level of strength. How did you get to that level? And despite everything, you want to be part of the coalition? So Jin asked, remembering how her comrade had easily broken the stone wall in the afternoon. She stood up from the boulder and added that she wasn't even sure about their current dialogue and whether it was a good idea to talk to him. What the girl knew for sure was that if it was dangerous for her to know Mu Young's identity, then old man Song-wol would not allow them to meet. So let him quickly tell her who he was. They looked intently into Mushin's eyes, and they looked at each other for about a minute. Afterwards, the young man added that Song-wol knew the path he was on, and if the girl even knew anything about his identity, she should guess for herself by following him to his intended destination, but without asking unnecessary questions. Since the old man had sent her to Mu Young, the answers to her questions lurked in the man's chosen path. The girl replied that she didn't care about his path, but he said that in that case she didn't care about the answers she wanted either. Since she will follow him, let her train well, for he does not need a burden on the trek, and she must also remain steadfast, for what awaits them will be difficult to endure. Finishing his dialogue with a vague riddle, he left, leaving the girl alone. He walked down the street lamp-lit path and pondered how this girl could be so stubborn and persistent. Yet he smiled. "We barely managed to subdue her by summoning 5 warriors," said the soldier, holding a torch in front of the girl's body, showing his superiors. "She had no intention of killing, but she was a tough nut to crack, especially for a woman. In the grounds of one of the Academy's secret buildings, where there was a library with forbidden books, the army found Ah Young sneaking in. Sir Juge, Do-won, and Lee Kyung couldn't believe their eyes that this humble student could do such a thing. She was lying unconscious on the ground, bound tightly with ropes. Yoon couldn't believe that Baek Wol-moon's daughter could do such a low act. The underground library was full of martial arts books, and it was considered a crime to sneak in there without permission. According to the guards, the girl was alone, but that did not negate the fact that someone might have helped her, or might have prompted such mischief, given that she had arrived with her brother and sister. Juge ordered the soldiers to take the girl into custody and question her when she awoke. The incident was not to spread outside of the coalition, so they had to make sure that the investigation would go well, and some sacrifices would have to be made, even if Baek Ah Young would suffer because of it, and relations with Baek Wol-moon would deteriorate. Regardless, they must abide by the rules and laws of the coalition, setting an example for the rest of us. In the dark of night, one of the soldiers approached the coalition leader and reported that he had just been notified of Baek Ah Young's arrest. The elder nodded positively, happy that his bait had been taken. Morning came. All participants in the Cheonso-Dane entrance exam were asked to assemble at the practice area. The young men began to gather, and one of the Yang twins noticed and told Baek Gong that his little sister wasn't with them, and he hadn't seen her all morning. Ha-on also said she hadn't seen her. Gong reassured them by saying that she loves solitude and won't be late and will arrive on time, just separate from the others. But the young man, for whom family ties and the bond with his own brother were one of the most important factors in life, said that even if Gon's sister preferred to behave this way, and he did not know where she was, could he remain so careless and not be the least bit worried? Ha! He started yelling at him. How dare he say something like that to them, pushing his brother to get closer to the accuser. But Gong placated his sister and replied that Ah Young was just distancing himself because of the usual family conflict, so asked him to understand. Chan Hyun, taking a proud look, said that distance always increases and conflicts will inevitably escalate. He wanted to give them advice, but at that moment Brother Hyuk grabbed him by the neck and, rubbing his head with his other hand, clasping it under his armpit, began apologizing for the twin for saying so much and anything that came to mind, and asked him to ignore them so as not to inconvenience the honorable Baek clan representatives. Gon was silent, giving them an angry look. Next, they walked to the enclosed training area inside the building. Usually practiced outside, it was most likely meant for training in bad weather, or specialized, to test soldiers' movements in a confined, closed space. Chang Hyun noticed that there were coalition soldiers standing around the perimeter, along all four walls, and expressed his thought to his comrades that it looked like they were holding them here by force, and were afraid they would run away, as if they had done something wrong. His suspicions, unfortunately, were justified. A middle-aged man approached them and said loudly that those gathered must be likely to be confused and bewildered now, unless, of course, they were guilty, but if still the opposite, they should be very alarmed. None of the participants understood anything, and only Mu Young looked at the man with an angry look, knowing in advance that something bad had happened. The man introduced himself as Do-won. Wu Young-sob exclaimed that this was the same legendary great sword Do-won. One of the twins marveled, adding that he was one of the Lords of the Blade, just like the Iron Law Lee Kyung. The man continued and said that he wanted to welcome them all with joy and honor them for their hard work. But because of the unpleasant event that occurred last night, he was not at liberty to do so. One of the students broke into the underground library last night and rummaged through the martial arts books. The whole team was shocked. Gong didn't want to believe that it could have been Ah Young, since she was the only one missing. But the man said that the only person missing from the gathering was the culprit. Baek Ah Young resisted at the scene but was captured and is now in custody. She will be interrogated and found out why she did what she did. The helpers and instigators will also be found. And that's why all the other participants have been gathered in this training room. Until this case is resolved, the examinations will be postponed indefinitely. All will have to remain in place until the end of the interrogation as suspects. Baek's brother and sisters were furious to hear what their sister had done. Gong bowed to Do-won, and after introducing himself and his clan, asked again if it was true that Ah-young wasn't with them because he was in prison. He couldn't believe those words, and his brain thought they were absurd, so he dared to clarify the obvious again. He asked if they were really sure his sister had done it. Do-won replied that she had been found right in the library, standing in the middle of open books and resisting, so her guilt was certain. But Gong wouldn't budge, and began to argue that the whole thing must be some kind of misunderstanding. And Yong wouldn't do anything that would disgrace the family name. His clan should send their investigative teams to cooperate with the coalition. Do-won interrupted him, saying it wasn't necessary. This happened on coalition territory, so only the coalition itself would be involved in the investigation. The man walked out of the camp, ordering the guards outside to keep a close eye on the suspects to make sure they did not leave the camp at any time, and closed the doors tightly. The guards standing around the perimeter of the room came out to guard them from the outside. Baek-gun began shouting his name to the head man in his wake to try to talk some more. But the man besieged him with a stern look before he left. He told the boy not to force him to repeat everything again, and to stumble away. The young man grew dark and lowered his gaze to the floor. Time passed. The students were seated on the floor sharing their guesses about what had happened. Jang Hyuk said it all made no sense. Why would an innocent girl like Ah-young do such an act? How so? Woo Young-sob replied that now that he thought about it, he remembered that the girl looked very agitated, like she was in a bind the last time he saw her last night. Lee Bom added that he also remembered that she didn't look like her usual self, but she certainly didn't look like she was going to do anything bad. Perhaps it was a mistake, or maybe curiosity just took over. Ha-on countered with a counter-question. Was she really so stupid as to act against the laws out of curiosity? But that version they decided not to rule out. The twins went on talking, suggesting that she might actually be up to something. And then the older sister couldn't stand it, stood up and yelled at them. How dare they say such a thing? She demanded that they stop talking nonsense and just wait for the investigation to be over. It was very satisfying to listen to the rest of them hang various attempts at crimes on their sister without knowing the truth. Brother Gong continued to sit on the floor and with a grim look, told his sister that they couldn't wait that long. He could not understand why Ah-young would do such a thing. It was a direct obligation for their family's investigative team to be involved, and given how stubbornly the coalition would not allow it, then it was coming out that there was something wrong here. They needed to find out personally what reason Ah-young might have had for doing this. Ha-on replied that she was in custody and they were locked up, and there was nothing they could do. Mu-young, who had been silent all this time, said, "For the sake of your family's honor, I would advise you to just wait for the coalition investigation." Hearing this, Gon asked again what he meant, and Mushin continued, "Think of it as advice. From what I've heard and seen you act, you should prioritize the honor of your family over the innocence and safety of the girl." Meanwhile, the library was being thoroughly searched. The investigating officers carefully inspected all the books and shelves, and then presented a report to Lord Zhug. The search revealed that the only clue was that the girl was looking for something quickly in a hurry, as all the books were flipped through in a hurry and scattered on the floor. Nothing gave away her intentions or purpose, and they also checked the existence of all books, documents, and scrolls against the catalog that served as an inventory. But by all appearances, everything was in place, and she had not stolen anything. Perhaps she was looking for something in particular, but this document was not in the library. At this point, one of the soldiers came down to them and bowed, and informed them that Mr. Juge was looking for the head. At this time, Baek-gong declared to his comrades' defiant advice that he, the eldest of the Baek-Wolmoon family, and also the eldest brother of Ah-young, and in his mind the honor of the family and the sister herself were equivalent. He did not want to just sit and wait, and told Mushin that if he was not going to help, he should be kind enough to watch his words. Mushin grinned and replied that the prison was well guarded by some of the best soldiers in the coalition, so it would be almost impossible to get in. Battles could not be avoided, and Baek-gun needed allies. The clan's young heir looked at Mu-young tensely. Mushin began to tell him that from what he saw, The prison was surrounded by high, impenetrable walls and guarded by about 20 soldiers. With the abilities of their squad, they would be able to sneak in. He was confident in the strength of his comrades. The competition between them, on the tough assignments where they had to stand shoulder to shoulder, was gone altogether. He commanded them to take their equipment and get to the prison undetected. After they managed to neutralize the guards, they could talk to Ah Young. The most important thing is that there are no casualties on either side, but they will need to act according to the circumstances, so it won't be absolutely necessary. Everyone nodded affirmatively, showing that they understood the instructions. So Jin stared tensely at the guy and didn't understand his actions. He was trying to join the coalition, and yet he was doing something that would make him their enemy. As night fell, the boys began to carry out their plan. She began to look into the cracks in the walls, boarded up with wooden boards, where the guards stood at their posts. Peeping out Hyuk, who was sitting on Hyung's neck as the holes in the walls were high enough, reported that the shift was over and there were 4 men guarding the doors. Baekgon said that this was their last chance to leave, for it had nothing to do with them, and could not only affect them negatively, they could all become enemies of the country's most powerful military organization. Gong said he couldn't be responsible for all the consequences that would come out of it. Jang Hyuk replied that food brought them closer together, and they'd been eating out of the same bowl for days, so this whole situation applied to them too. Lee Bum remarked that the Baek clan heir is afraid that all his comrades will make him responsible for them, refusing to take responsibility by making him and his sisters look guilty. Woo Young-sob said that even if he stays on the sidelines, he will still be blamed for not stopping them, which is the same thing. Gong said that none of them would regret what they did afterwards, because if they don't back down now, there's nothing to be gained back afterwards. Mushin said that none of them were going to regret, and told the whole group to be a hope for Ah Young. He was counting on Ha-on, who was irritably preparing for the first part of the plan. She replied that she wasn't doing it all because she wanted to, and then knocked on the front door from inside to get the guard's attention, and asked to be taken to the bathroom because she had eaten something bad earlier, and now her stomach was twisting badly. The guard asked if it was urgent, to which she replied that it was very much so. The other guards told the comrade not to embarrass the girl among the men, and to escort her out. He opened the door a small slit to make sure she was safe, but he could not react in time. Behind Ha-hee stood Mushin, who knocked out the guard with a single movement. Then he ran out, and with just a couple of small strokes of his hands and fists, he defeated the remaining 3. All 4 guards lay unconscious on the ground. The students tied them up with ropes and placed them inside the training room, closing the doors behind them. They jumped onto one of the rooftops and ran toward the prison, whose walls were built in the shape of a fortress, with guards standing in the recesses. They jumped onto the tops of the fortress and began to fight the soldiers. Meanwhile, Do-won came to the training camp, and he noticed that there were no guards near the imprisoned disciples. At first he thought those lazy gawkers had gone somewhere, but then he suspected something wrong and opened the doors of the house to find the subordinates tied up unconscious. One of the lancers on guard began to yawn. Jang Hyuk, looking out from below, told him that since he was yawning, he should rest. The man looked at him incomprehensibly, and when he realized, Brother Hyun had already hit the soldier on the back of the head, and he fell to the ground. Ha-on tied up another soldier with her strings, and Gong punched him in the head. Woo Young-sob began choking the third one so that he would lose consciousness from lack of oxygen, but he didn't die. Lee Bom came to his aid, elbowing the man in the stomach. The fourth one was knocked out by So-jin, hitting him in the face, causing the man to fly into the wall. Mushin said he didn't think she would go with all the others, but the girl replied that since she was going his way, she should follow everywhere, and he was talking nonsense. The guards inside the prison were urgently ordered to close the gate. Everyone ran to the entrance with torches, and armed they waited for the enemies. The rebellious recruits were regarded as some of the finest martial artists, the soldiers told each other, preparing for a showdown with the strongest practitioners. The squad leader ordered his subordinates that if they saw the outlaws, have them detain them immediately and call the others for help. Do-won and Lee Jeom were already walking toward the fortress. talking amongst themselves about how all these young men were just giving up their outstanding performance like this, doing so only to save the girl. It didn't make any sense. Li Jiom assumed that they might have gotten something more valuable, or were not planning to join the coalition at all. The guards greeted Master Do-won and reported that there had been a skirmish at the prison, and they were sure it was the recruits. One guard began to attack Mushin with his spear, but he easily dodged the sharp tip and then grabbed his face and knocked him to the floor. So-jin saw this blow and remembered how she shattered a wooden sword to save the man from his attacker. Now, seeing her friend's abilities in hand-to-hand combat, she realized that that action of hers when they first met had been unnecessary. She kicked the man in the face one more time, lying near the wall. Gong walked down the hallway where Li Bom and Wu Young-sob were. They approached Mu Young and So-jin and said that one of the soldiers had escaped. Wu Young admitted that it was his fault. He was sure that the guard had passed out, but he woke up and escaped. So now the coalition soldiers will be here any minute, as soon as the soldier reaches them and tells them everything. Mushin replied that it was to be expected anyway, considering how much noise they had made. They needed to concentrate on finding Lady Baek once they were inside. He, in the meantime, would guard the entrance. The god of war touched the duster of the gate, and pressing lightly with his phalanges, knocked the door off its hinges, and it shattered into wooden planks and splinters in different directions. On this side stood a crowd of warriors who shouted them out from nowhere, but the outstanding students, joined by the twins at the last moment, were the first to attack the army, striking out their weapons. Wu Young-sob came to one knee in the distance. A red stain seeped through the light fabric of his pants. Mushin noticed, and asked his comrade if everything was all right. The shy young man replied that it was nothing serious, but that he was bleeding a lot. Mushin decided to guard the fellow and prevented him from going any further. So Jin asked if he could really guard the gate alone, but then realized that she had asked foolishly, underestimating Wu Young's strength and power. The army, led by Li Kyung and Do-won, reached the main prison building. The warriors jumped onto the crucible of the fortress, unhooking any exit from the grounds, and the two leaders entered through the main entrance. The academy leader ordered the others to check and take care of the wounded. He began to tell Mu Young that this was the place where the most vile people were locked up. It should be the safest place in the coalition, and their team had done such a thing by encroaching on this area, only to save a friend who might still be guilty of what they had done. The man knew what drove the young men to such an act, so if they surrendered voluntarily now, they would be justly punished. If not, they, like criminals, would pay for the damage with their lives. Mushin, who was blocking the passage to the dungeon where the prisoners were sitting, replied that he and his comrades simply wanted to know the truth. They didn't want to aggravate the situation either, so he asked them to step back. Li Kyung began to shout with anger. How dare this young man say such a thing to them, devaluing their abilities? But Do-won blocked the main man's way to calm him down, and replied that they had already told them all the truth. Mushin asked if this was the truth the coalition told them to tell. The second man also became angry and asked a counter-question. Could the young man doubt the coalition? Do you, Do-won, do you believe? Do you believe that everything the coalition says is true and fair? He continued the verbal altercation with questions. We put everything on the line for the truth. Are you willing to put everything on the line for the truth of the coalition? Li Kyung stepped forward, and after shouting the word enough, he raised his fist in the air, letting the warriors know to launch an attack on the criminals. He shouted that he would no longer allow Mu Young to be so insolent. The order came to capture all the intruders, and a crowd of armed swordsmen and lances moved toward Mushin. One of the soldiers executed a slashing oblique blow with a cold weapon. Then the blade did not have time to touch Mushin's forehead, but the young practitioner dodged the sword and it crashed into the stone floor. Next, the second soldier also began to attack with his sword, and almost touched the tip of the weapon to his opponent's face. But Mu Young struck him in the face, dropping him to the ground, and the previous one kicked him. Another attacked next, but the god struck his sword with the edge of his hand and it broke in two. Afterwards he grabbed another soldier, whose sword flew off in the direction of another soldier. eventually dealing with all the opponents without difficulty, knocking them to the ground, but striking them so that none of them died. The entire crowd was defeated. The next batch of soldiers were badly frightened and were amazed at the strength of this stranger. All were afraid of their turn, having seen how he easily felled the previous troop in one blow. Mushin noticed their fear and didn't want to fight much himself, and so he said that nothing good would come of further escalation. The more soldiers arrived, the more they would win until they eventually questioned Ah Young. He asked the soldiers to take the wounded away. At that moment, Li Qiang and Do Wan ran up to them and started yelling at their subordinates. How dare they be afraid of this rascal? Aren't they ashamed to be honorary coalition warriors after that? They stood still in a stance, and covering themselves with the leader and encouraged, wanted to continue the fight. But at that moment, Mu Yong picked up the sharp tip that had broken off the weapon of one of the wounded and threw it in the direction of the soldiers. It rushed between the heads of the soldiers, and it almost hit Li Qiang's forehead, but the latter managed to react and throw the blade aside with the hilt of his sword. From the impact, the trajectory changed, and the tip plunged into the concrete floor. The man was terrified. He could barely block the blow. Mushin aimed at his forehead without even looking, a warning that he could take their lives whenever he wished. Mushin said there should be no casualties on either side, but since they didn't care, he thought there was nothing to be done about it, and asked them to step back for the broken tip if they didn't want to be crippled for the rest of their lives. The soldiers and Do Wan were surprised, and Li Qiang burst into laughter. Laughing, he said that he didn't know what part of the country the young man grew up in, but he was now in the Murim coalition. He pulled his sword from its sheath and went to Mu Yong, adding that he shouldn't be so cocky just because his skills are good. He raised his sword and exclaimed, "To the Murim coalition." Mushin said he warned to stay away, but apparently they have a hearing problem. The head of the coalition called him a bastard, and with incredible speed ran at the young man with the weapon. Sword 2 grazed the lad's chest, but he was able to dodge, and the sword slipped a millimeter from his flesh. God was surprised, for he had rarely seen warriors of this caliber. His fame was not in vain. No wonder he is one of the lords of the blade of the Murim coalition, he thought. Meanwhile, the man struck another blow, intending to undercut his opponent's legs, but he managed to jump up over the cold blade in time and pushed off the wall, lingering in the air, and hit Li Qiang in the head with his second leg. But he blocked the blow with his hand and kicked the guy in the stomach, and then swung his sword to finish off his student, but could only plunge the knife into the wall. Mushin managed to escape in time and ended up near the head of the academy while he was pulling out his sword, not immediately realizing where his opponent was. Do Wan was worried about his friend when the student was behind him in the blind spot. He struck with his fist, but the head managed to pull his blade out and blocked the blow with it. However, the shockwave was strong, and he rolled backwards on the slippery floor. Li Qiang was surprised by this incredible force of the fist, and by the way the young man disappeared for a moment. Do Wan stood in suspense, marveling at how this self-taught practitioner was able to dodge Li Qiang's blade and throw him back in one blow. This young man had many secrets, and now everyone knew it. Do Wan wondered who Mu Yong really was. "I thought you were just bluffing, but you seem to have an impressive level of strength. However, you're the criminal who wreaked havoc on the coal." Before Li Qiang could finish, a spearhead flew towards him again. Do Wan, who had shielded his comrade, was able to chop it up in mid-air. Mushin repeated once more that they were only looking for the truth they didn't want to be told. The two leaders began to call him a fool because of the desired truth they had the entire coalition. Would they now be able to oppose the organization with 9 men? And why was it necessary to do all this, knowing that they would not be able to handle the whole army? Mu Yong chuckled at the words that they wouldn't be able to handle it. He replied that he was now standing in front of the two lords of the coalition blade, and he was doing just fine so far. They marveled at his courage and self-confidence, and warned that he was on a very dangerous path. But the young practitioner parried that his path was the right one. Do Wan said that he claimed so because he wanted to believe it, and together with his companion they headed in the direction of the apprentice. He again told them not to say later that they hadn't warned them, and with clenched fists prepared for battle. The two men ran at the young man with their swords, and at that moment an open fan split the air, which boomeranged on the backs of the leaders' heads as it circled them, and returned to its owner's hands. Sir Jug stood on the roof of the fortress, and said that though he wanted to know how it would end, he had to interrupt them. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, Baekgon and the rest of the boys found Ah Young's cell, and after finding the keys, they went in to see her. She woke up and regretfully told her older brother that she had indeed infiltrated the underground library. She had nothing more to say, and she asked her family to understand her. Everyone was shocked and realized that they were now accomplices in crime, and now they were in big trouble. All the students went back to Mushin. Gon was leading his little sister, holding her by the shoulders. They saw that there was a living wall of soldiers all over the roof of the fortress, and there were Li Kyung, Do Won, and Juge Yong below near Mu Young. Things were not going well, so thought the young man. Sir Jug was glad to see that the whole team was now assembled. He was in a very upbeat and friendly mood. Gong turned tensely to Mu Young to say something to him. Do Won interrupted the heir to the Baek clan, and asked Juge to stop wasting time and explain everything faster, and what, after all, is going on. Sir Juge turned to the accused girl, asking her to show him what she was hiding under her clothes. If she pulls it out and gives it to him, nothing will happen. It is necessary to prove her innocence. She asked him to swear that nothing would really happen, and then she pulled an envelope out from behind her groove and held it out to the man. He swore to her on his life. He asked her how she had received the letter, and the girl told him that after her examinations were over, while she was resting under a tree, the wind brought it to her. The examiner confirmed that this was the case and that it was only because of this letter. No one understood anything, and then the man began to read aloud the contents. The 9 people who passed the entrance exams in Cheonso-dan are likely to be an obstacle to our cause of the future. Therefore, you must execute them and hang them in front of the training halls. The details of who will carry out the elimination and the time when it will take place can be found in the underground library. In the book. Further, part of the letter was corrupted, and the title of the book was impossible to read. If the plan is revealed or fails, wreak havoc by setting fire to the coalition, were the last lines of the letter. The girl said she wanted to stop the enemy's plan at all costs, without telling anyone, by finding that book, which contained all the data. Zhug replied to Ah Young that she didn't know what the book was, so she had to look through all the books in the library. The girl agreed with that. The Chang twins were touched by the act of a friend who wanted to save them all from execution. And that included the coalition itself, Li Bom added. Zhuge confirmed the young men's words. Her actions were reckless and very much against the rules of the coalition, but her intentions were pure. And the same applied to all the other members from the cohesive team, standing against an invincible enemy to save her comrade, while at the same time seeking the truth. It was an impressive feat. Do Won asked where the book that contained information about the attack on the coalition was, and Yon guiltily replied that she couldn't find it. Do Won asked her, hadn't she looked at all the books in the library? And then Sir Zhug replied that no book existed. That letter was a fabrication. Li Kyung didn't believe what was happening. The examiner replied that he didn't believe it either, and had no idea until this moment. But he was reminded of the words of leader Murim, who asked him at the meeting if the recruits would break the law to save their comrades. And afterwards, when the leader mentioned the need for a new test at the meeting, he was already laying the groundwork for that test, to see if they would notice the lies and injustice lying before them and be willing to confront it in order to open the eyes of everyone else. The whole puzzle came together. It was a critical situation, the staging of which even the leaders themselves did not know, so that everything would come naturally and test truly how far the members of the new group of dragons could go. The 3 leaders looked at the 9 young men with pride, and Mushin smiled, as if he knew the outcome ahead of time. The soldiers on post in other parts of the academy grounds met together, lighting the night way with torches. 2 walked to the passer-by, asking where he was going if he should be in prison now. But the latter replied that the whole conflict had already been resolved, and the soldiers were now ordered to open the gates and return to their posts. The 2 soldiers who had missed everything began to ask what had happened. But the third answered them that he was guarding the fortress from the outside and knew nothing, and then asked his colleagues to relay the order to the northerners. They answered in the affirmative, as they were on their way there themselves. As they left, they said among themselves that after they had relayed the message, they would be sure to find out from the others what had happened inside the prison after all. The remaining soldier looked after them and then went outside the coalition territory into the forest to relay the message to the man who was hiding behind the tree trunks and wrapped in a robe that hid his face, that the leaders had proved Bekwal Moon's daughter was innocent. The elderly man was outraged, saying that they should have executed her on the spot, so how did they get the charges against her dropped? As the soldier's story revealed, Sir Juge intervened. They wouldn't let the soldiers into the prison grounds, so he couldn't hear what they were talking about. But after it was over, the soldiers of the Juge clan began to offer praise. Word spread that they had opposed the coalition for the sake of justice. Fearlessly opposing the coalition for justice, before Yong and the Juge clan soldiers entered the prison, I heard that the coalition leader met with Yong. It turns out that the leader personally intervened to help create a new group of Yong Qiandan dragons. I wanted to nip them in the bud, but I only helped them blossom, the man thought frustratedly, pulling his hood better over his eyes. He ordered his spy to find out as much as he could about everything, and then he left the place of their meeting. And Young was sleeping sweetly in her bed. From across the street, peering behind the curtain, a worried older brother watched her. Mushin came up to Gong, which made him frightened, and said that Ah Young was just sleeping because she was overworked. She was lying on the cold prison floor, so her current sound sleep was understandable. Bekgon asked his comrade if he knew that this would happen, to which the young man replied that more than that, he was sure that it would happen as it did. The young man didn't understand how he could be sure if his sister hadn't told anyone about the letter. But Mu Young said he didn't know about the letter, but he guessed what she was going to do. The older brother was still not satisfied, if he only guessed at his sister's actions, how he knew ahead of time the whole outcome of events. But even then, Mu Young found an answer, saying that there could be no doubt of innocence, because he knew Lady Baek, even though they hadn't known each other for that long. This struck a blow to the conscience of the older brother, who had neglected the younger one for years. Mushin then admonished him that instead of talking, the lad had better spend this time getting his sister some water and being there for her, as an older brother should do. Away from the camp, Wu Young-sob was sitting on a rock, holding his hands to his sore, bandaged knee. Mushin approached him to inquire about the wound, and he replied that Lady Han's ointment seemed to have helped a lot, and now the wound no longer hurt. Afterward, the boy said it was great that the situation was resolved without too much trouble, but now he wonders what awaits them tomorrow. Mu Young told him to rest, and he went into the forest. Young-sob asked his friend where he was going, to which the man replied that he wanted some reflection. The wounded man replied that he could share with him whatever was on his mind, and accepting these kind words, Mushin said that he wanted to be alone now and went back to the woods. He stood under the starry sky with his eyes covered. Memories of the day before, when they had been praised for being willing to break the law for the sake of justice, ran through his mind. A single thought hung in my mind: stand up to them. At that moment a rustle was heard in the bushes, and then someone ran swiftly toward the man. He did not turn around, but was ready to strike his attacker. He turned his body around and extended his arm at the last moment to grab the insolent man. At that moment the old friend closed his arms in a defensive stance, yelling for the man to stop. Mushin slowed down and recognized Yun Hyun. The young fellow wanted to surprise him, but as he realized, for the possessor of first-class reflexes, that was impossible. He was very happy to see Master Mu Seol again, but he quickly realized that no one called the man that now, and greeted him as a friend named Mu Young. This new habit was difficult for him. Mushin was happy to see his friend too, and smiled back at him. Mu Young asked his friend why he hadn't come to see him all this time. The guy began to explain that it was forbidden to meet with candidates during exams, and if they were caught even meeting like that, they would be in big trouble. But why did Un Hyun come? Mushin assumed that he heard rumors about Lady Baek Ah Young's arrest, and the lover was worried about her safety, so he decided to find out. But the confused young man protested that he didn't intend to do anything of the sort because he and Lady Baek were complete strangers. Mu Young grinned and told his friend that he would give his regards to Lady Baek from him. But the latter again confusedly asked him not to, because they really didn't know each other and had only bumped into each other a couple of times. Then they decided to discuss the purpose of the exam itself. As a rule, they determine which candidates are most likely to pass, and carefully plan for a change in Cheon So-dan's lineup, Woon Hyun said. But strangely enough, that hasn't happened this year, and I haven't been able to find out what the reasons are for that. Mushin had long suggested that their squad had some new purpose this year, and asked Eun Hyun if Cheon So-dan was assigning inspection missions. The young man hesitated and then answered that he did not. Mu Young then replied that the academy was going to send them on inspection missions, and it looked like the leader had initiated it himself. Eun Hyun said that in that case he believed that the most plausible explanation was that they were going to create a new group that would focus on inspections. Most likely they were trying to maintain high standards. Mu Jin thought about it and said that maybe, under the pretext of inspections, they're going to get rid of those who oppose them, and they want recruits to lead that. Friend reasoned that even if that were the case, the coalition wouldn't do it right away. Morning came. Ah Young woke up and got out of bed. There was a bowl of water and a pillory by her bedside. She was surprised at someone's show of care. The pill must have been for strength and to improve health after fatigue. All the students gathered and walked to the initiation ceremony. Do-won stood in front of them and gave his speech. The exams evaluating your skills were completed yesterday. In the exams you showed us how good you all are. I applaud you from the bottom of my heart. You all did a wonderful job, but the reality that you will soon face will be much harsher and more painful than the exams. All the students listened attentively to their mentor, and the mentor continued. We are at war with new enemies, and these enemies are in our midst, hiding among us under the guise of friends and comrades. They have their hands on everything we have created, extending their influence. Everything we have fought for and defended has fallen at their feet all along. Through careful internal checks, we will establish their identities and put an end to their atrocities. And I too will carry out this important mission in place of all of you. But I will not force you to do so, and the choice is in your hands. If you wish to join me in the fight against the insidious enemies among us, write your names and put your seal on your contracts. Be reborn again as members of the Coalition's internal inspection team called Yon Cheon-dan. All 9 warriors sat on their knees. In front of them lay scrolls with contracts, seals, and swords issued to them. The recruits rolled up their sleeves and dipped their right palms into the black substance, then left their imprint in the contract. Do-won watched them, and his gaze turned to Mu Young, who continued to stare into the contract and did not sign it, unlike his comrades who had already done so. The leader of the new squad recalled Sira Zhuge's words about this warrior. We have nothing on him, no motives, no background. From what we have seen, he is a double-edged sword that is hard to control. If we can handle him, he makes a great sword, but if not, the teacher warned on the eve. Still, Mu Young signed the contract and came with the others to the building allotted to Yon Cheon-dan's group. It was their new dormitory. The Jiang twins rejoiced and marveled at what an amazing and comfortable place they were placed in. They were even more excited about their new military uniforms. Baek Gong looked at them from the upstairs window and could not understand such joy of the 2 brothers, who could rarely wear such luxurious clothes. Ha-on replied that she had no idea what they had in mind and adjusted her sleeves. Then she strained to say that the leader had not even attended the founding ceremony. But afterwards she jumped to another topic, inspecting her new uniform, and mumbling that overall it didn't look too bad, even though she wasn't particularly fond of that color. The men's uniforms were all dark gray, and the girls had red inserts added. The older brother dropped his head sorrowfully on his palm, covering his eyes, tired of his sister who cared so much about appearance. Lee Bom helped Woo Young put on his uniform, and adjusting it at his shoulders answered him that it fit him perfectly. Ah Young and So Jin were already ready too. Chan Hyung knocked on the door to Mushin's room and found that he still hadn't changed. He informed him that everyone else had long ago put on their uniforms. The commander had already arrived and was waiting for them. so he urgently needed to change and go out as well. Hyun was used to addressing his comrade as Master Mu, but now he had been appointed vice commander of the squad, and everyone needed to start getting used to addressing Mushin that way. The man changed his clothes and walked out to the others. The twins admired the older man. Just the change of clothes had turned him into a completely different person, or maybe he had always been that way. But the previous equal clothing spoiled the perception of this strong, handsome man. So Jin looked at him too, and a blush appeared on her cheeks. They returned to Do-won, who began with a lecture stating that, as Murim's history has shown, justice without strength cannot be done in our world. So even on days without official training, squad members would have to hone their strength by training on their own. He asked if they understood him, and the response was a resounding, "Yes, sir." Then he said they would not be trained by him but by another mentor. He wanted to introduce him, but the warrior who had come asked to introduce himself. He stood on the roof and then jumped down into it with such force that small stones flew across the stone floor, and the slab itself pressed slightly into the ground. Everyone marveled at this incredible aura. Do-won greeted his comrade. He was a middle-aged man with a thick black mustache and beard, and one of his eyes was blind and covered with a large scar. It was evident that this man had seen a great deal of battle and a wealth of experience and harsh hardening. Mushin noticed that he looked familiar to him, but could not remember where he had seen him before in his past life. The trainer said he was looking forward to meeting his students, but before he introduced himself, he wanted to test their skills. The man clenched his palm into a fist, and a shockwave aura began to radiate from him again, pushing the young warriors back some distance. He pointed 2 palms toward the twins and struck with one light touch, dropping them to the ground. Then he struck Lee Bom in the stomach with his fist. He tried to stand his ground but still flew into the wall. Ha-hee and Ah-young tied his hands with their strings, but he was stronger and pulling his arms toward him, twisting their strings in his palms. He fell the girls and punched both of them in their stomachs. Afterwards, he stepped on Woo Young Sob's head with his foot and wanted to hit Mu Young with his palm, but he easily deflected the attack by covering his head with his hand. Xiao Jin and Baek Gong were standing beside each other and were on the ready to fight the trainer. But what caught his attention was Mushin's repulsive attack, which he never expected from the new recruit. Mushin remembered the man. It was Guan Am, the unholy fist. The trainer's hand cramped from Mu Young's block. It felt to him as if he had hit something very solid. The trainer said that he had heard that there was a melee fighter in the prison who had crushed the coalition warriors. Apparently, it was the same recruit who was able to fight back now. The man struck again with his fist in the face, which the young practitioner dodged, and went behind his back. The angry master kicked in that direction, threatening that he would not get away from him. But Mushin easily dodged the leg kick over his head. Guan Am called the lad a sly fox, and that he made him doubt his own strikes. The experienced warrior summoned his chi power, and again emitting an even greater energy field, called the Spirit King's fist style, directed a crushing fist toward the apprentice, but he extended his palm and covered the other man's fist with it to stop the blow. Do-won was shocked that Mu Young was able to block the Spirit King's fist style of Master Guan Am. The trainer himself was convinced of his hunch. There was certainly no mistake on his technique. Before his fist touched the disciple's hand, he could feel the energy of his fist being offset by an aura of corresponding strength. Apparently this recruit was capable of using a protective aura. But how could such a sucker be so capable? Do-won stood between the 2 warriors and asked them to stop, telling the trainer that it was more than enough for demonstration training. He didn't want to scare off all the students before the official training began, did he? The trainer sighed and introduced himself to the squad, calling himself Unholy Fist Guan Am. He would be in charge of their training, and the real training would begin tomorrow. It would be very difficult and exhausting, so they only had a day left to gather their spirits for further exhaustion and practice. Everyone stood in line and answered him statutorily, "Yes, sir." After some time, Guan Am stood in the garden of the academy and looked at his fist, whose knuckles had developed abrasions that no rival had been able to cause on his skin in a long time. It was simply unthinkable for him to receive such scratches from a new recruit. Murim, the leader, approached him and asked what the man was worried about. He was startled by the sudden appearance of the leader and bowed hastily. The elder heard people talking about how indifferent he was to young Qian-dan, but he hoped most for the success of this group. So he asked the soldier to train the coalition's New Hope well, and he also asked him to pay special attention to someone he deemed unthinkable. The unholy fist bowed and asked the head not to worry about anything. He was already giving him special attention. At night before dawn came, So Jin walked out of the dormitory toward the training camp. She wasn't used to her new uniform, which still felt a little stingy in her hands and constrained her movements. So the girl decided to come to practice before everyone else to warm up properly and get used to her new clothes. But when she got to the set, she noticed Mu Young. He was standing there with his fists clenched. The muscles in his face were tense and his eyes were closed. Smoke was emanating from his body, an aura filled with magical chi power. The concentration of Mushin's power shaped the winds around him. The clouds thickened and the leaves from the trees fell under the flow of the air. He remembered his past life's power. At the first step, he could break a huge tree trunk. At 2 steps and 3 steps, he could break boulders. At 4, he could break the earth in 2, and so on up to 12 steps. He was able with his strength to break anything, regardless of size or severity. He fell to his knees. He was only able to withstand the concentration of 12 steps. Having gone through a complete transformation and absolute restoration, he had conquered death and gained a body many decades younger. But it cost him the last, most important step. He had lost some of his power after awakening in this body. He took a deep breath, and then asked his friend how long she would stand by. The girl thought that with such concentration he hadn't noticed her coming. But even standing with his back to her with his eyes closed, he could feel her presence, and could easily tell what kind of person was standing behind him. She came up to him and asked, "What are the people they will meet likely to be like him?" He asked her in response if she was afraid. Courage stems from fear. Courage without fear is not courage, Mushin agreed. Afterward, he noticed that from the looks of it, So Jin had come to stretch before she started training. He wanted to leave her alone, but the girl pulled out her training sword and invited the guy to spar. He smiled and replied that he wouldn't hold back. At this time, Do-won was talking to Coach Guan-am. The coach was suggesting that the commander-in-chief formalize a partnership with Bi-yun-dan and Am-yun-dan. Do-won was sure that training within the coalition would be enough for the first time, and he didn't understand why there was such a rush to arrange a collaboration. But the coach had already negotiated everything. They are both very proud groups, so he was sure they would be great for training together with Yan Qiandan. Both groups replied that they would contact them personally and head out as soon as they were ready. Do-won didn't argue, trusting the experienced master, and expressing respect went to the training room to brief them again before the first official training session began. Bi-yun-dan and Am-yun-dan specialize in ambush training. They train day and night. I've heard that each of them is a martial arts master. I wonder if young Qian-dan will be able to stand up to them. The squad leader thought. He heard a noise on the training ground, and wondering who might be there at this hour, he opened the doors. Mu Young and So Jin had already been fighting each other for a long time. The girl wanted to strike the young man with her sword, but he dodged and wanted to strike back at her, but could only hit the air above her back. She too was agile and fast, and could dodge at lightning speed. She threw a leg kick, but the young man blocked the blow. She recoiled, and they looked into each other's eyes. Mushin replied to the girl that she was a very good fighter. Do-won was pleased with this eagerness to train the younger generation, for whom he had high hopes. The morning training began. Jang Hyuk fell to the ground, and his wooden sword was thrown aside. His brother Hyun called out to him, but his trainer shouted at him not to be distracted, and then hit him without touching him, causing the young man to fly away. He told the two brothers that if this had been a real fight, they would both be dead by now. He called for the next one, and a second later Pei Gong was already attacking him with his sword. But the mentor dodged, and already wanted to grab the guy by his clothes, voicing aloud that this was a hit-and-run tactic, but he wouldn't let him do that. The moment Guan-am reached out to him, a thin fishing line snaked around his wrist. Ah-young grabbed the trainer, and he called such a trick a cheap trick. At that moment, however, Ha-on tied his case, and Ah-young, releasing the threads from his hand, intertwined them with her sister's fishing line all over the coach's body. Baek Gon was about to make one last sword strike, but the man pushed him off with his foot in his stomach, and after pulling the strings off of him and wrapping them around his fist, he wanted to hit the girls again to teach them a lesson. But they hit him with the fishing line on either side of his face, right on his cheeks, and he realized that since yesterday, something had started to change in their behavior during the fight. Progress had already begun, and everyone was noticing new weaknesses and how they could disable the enemy. He let go of the strings and grabbed his face, telling them that such a trick was very dirty. Wu Young-sob ran toward him, noticing that his opponent had opened up. He was about to strike him with his training sword, but the man grabbed him by the throat and threw him at Ha-an, causing both students to fall. Ah-young looked in their direction, and the trainer again reminded no one to be distracted, and threw the sword in the girl's direction. Seo-jin, who was covering her friend, was able to fight it off, and the sword flew toward the coach. The girl said that if this had been a real fight, and Wu Young-sob's sword was real, Guan-am's left arm would have been cut twice already. The trainer smirked at her observation and put his left hand behind his back, giving his students the advantage, defending only his right. Seo-jin jumped up to strike her head with her sword, but the trainer dodged and noticed that the student was fast, trying to get her with her fist, but she managed to avoid the attack as well. And then she kicked the trainer on the shoulder, jumped back and wanted to strike her with the sword again, but the man grabbed her wrist and knocked her to the floor. He praised his student that it was an impressive attack, but still, she was a long way from beating him. But it was very good for the first time. He kicked her with his foot and she flew sideways on the floor. The reason he did that was because Seo-jin looked at him harshly and angrily, and he wouldn't tolerate such cocky looks from nasty girls. Next up was Lee Bom, and Guan-am was waiting for his student to attack. Mushin, who did not like this attitude toward his mentee, pressed his mentor with 3 fingers between his shoulder blades behind his back, adding that if the fight were real, the coach would already be dead. The man was shocked by such insolent behavior from his apprentice, daring to defy him. Do-won was walking through the camp, and he noticed that the cooks were pulling a wagon of food in pots down the trail toward the training area of Yan Qiandan's squad. He approached the cooks and asked if the students had come to lunch yet. They replied that they had indeed, and so they decided to welcome the food to them themselves, unless they decided to eat some other food themselves. Do-won apologized to the canteen staff and asked them to go back to the kitchen, that there was no need to take the cart anywhere. The students would soon come to lunch themselves. The cooks calmed down and went back inside. Do-won walked to the training, amazed that it was still going on even though it should have been over long ago since it was their first day. He began to think that Guan-am had made the young men overzealous and he wanted to stop him. When he opened the doors, he saw that all the members of the squad were standing in a row. He asked them what was going on, but afterward he saw what was on the training ground. Mu Young was standing in front of Guan-am. The master was furious that some brat had dared to humiliate his own mentor. The young man replied that he had only touched his vital point, and that decided the outcome of the fight. Was it humiliating for the master to admit defeat? The man began yelling at his apprentice to shut him up. He was about to put him in his place and, jumping on the tiled floor, hit the apprentice in the face with great force, but he dodged. The teacher then turned his body around and wanted to kick him in the head. But Mushin grabbed his leg and noticed that the teacher was not the same as yesterday. He was getting more and more powerful. Guan-am delivered the next punch with his fist, which Mu Yeon was able to block with the edge of his palm. Despite his mentor becoming more powerful, he continued to control his power. He restrained himself from hurting his student. However, he did not know what the reborn god of war was capable of. They clashed again, blocking each other's blows, and then Mushin told the trainer not to hold back and show his true strength. "Is an unholy fist so weak?" The trainer shouted that his student was so eager to die, and summoned his chi power. A most powerful aura began to emanate from his body. He struck Mu Young in the stomach, and then the guy flew aside, but was able to brace himself with his legs and break himself without allowing himself to fall. The trainer was surprised that the vice commander was able to stand on his feet after such a blow. Guan-am regretted what he had done. He really dared to lose control for a moment because of the provocation. Even if Mu Young had neutralized some of his power with his aura, at least 20% of his power must have gone inside him. The young man was on his knees, head bowed. White steam began to emanate from his body, as if he had begun to cool down. The man said he hadn't hit him in a vital point, but he would definitely be bedridden for a few days, and he could only blame himself for that. And he brought it on himself. After hearing this, Mushin calmly got to his feet with a nonchalant look, as if this blow did not bring him any pain. Guan Am was shocked and looked at his disciple with a wide-eyed, surprised look. A white, strong aura radiated from the young man, which seemed to have absorbed his opponent's blow, and from that it was absorbed and intensified. The longer the mentor stared at Mu Young, the more he saw the familiar silhouette in him, which at first he didn't recognize, and when he did, he refused to believe it. Behind the young man stood the silhouette of a middle-aged warrior who had seen battle, with a thick beard and a stern gaze. It was the silhouette of the famous god of war. At that moment, Do-Won ran up to them and said that enough was enough, and the duel could be ended. He turned to Mu Young and demanded an answer. How does he behave with his mentor? What kind of example is he setting since he's the vice commander? Not hearing an answer, he turned to his trainer and asked him to calm down. He began to make excuses for his subordinate, that unfortunately he was not trained in good manners, and asked to step in and understand. Guan Am continued to stare at Mu Young tensely. Mushin, Mu So-Vol, the god of war. His presence alone was enough to overwhelm anyone, but I'm sure he died 20 years ago for sure. Pondered Guan Am after his training, recalling before his eyes the image of the legendary deity whose power was equal to that of the mountains and forests, which he god smashed with one of his fists. He stood among the mountains, gazing into the distance as one could sometimes see standing Mu Young. But the mentor did not realize that Mushin had been reborn and had come to avenge them. He only thought that this young man would inherit this incredible power, as if it were his destiny or fate. 20 years had passed, and yet he had met someone with exactly the same aura. Either he was mistaken or something incredible had happened before his eyes. The master could not let go of these thoughts. Do-Won summoned Mu Young to his office for a preventative talk. He told the vice commander that Master Guan Am had defeated countless criminals and villains over the years, and maybe he didn't need to train with him, but the rest of the less experienced ones did. So he had to respect his training regimen and not cause any more trouble. Mu Young replied that he wasn't going to cause any problems and just... The commander-in-chief interrupted him, saying that he knew that the young man had some kind of agenda, that's for sure. Nevertheless, he was now a member of the coalition, and Yan Qiandan's vice commanders, and his actions and words should reflect his position, and Do-Won was confident that he could do so without oversight. Mushin replied indifferently that he would do his best and left the office. Do-Won looked after him. The god of war noted to himself that his leader was indeed surprised and suspected him of something, but what was on the man's mind he did not understand. He came to the squad and commanded that they would train among themselves tonight without Guan Am. He went on to say that he was sure they all felt after training with Master Guan Am what points and mistakes they should work on. They had a long way to go, and they should stay calm and move forward step by step. This applied to each of them. At sunset, Yun-Hyun ran into the trader Yang. From there, they walked down the road together, chatting about the latest news. The merchant asked the soldier if he was going to meet Mu at Yangqiandan. The young man answered in the affirmative. Then the merchant continued the conversation, saying that he realized from the first time they met that he wasn't that simple. Also, Yang heard that Mu Young had become Yangqiandan's deputy commander. Yun-Hyun replied that there wasn't anything that escaped the merchant's ears. What there is what there is. You asked me to tell you when the location of the martial arts master's exercise would be determined. Is that so? The merchant asked. Yun-Hyun was surprised that the decision to hold the exercises had already been made. He went to Mushin and broke the news. The martial arts master drills are one of Cheon So-Dan's notable events, where coalition members meet with other well-known sects and even receive teachings from those masters. Normally, the squads themselves and their commanders contact the sects to get their approval, but this time it seems that leader Murim himself took the initiative to choose the sect and the date of the event. Mushin asked which sect they would be heading to, and a friend replied that it was the Hebei Peng clan. God tensed, and Unhyun asked what was wrong with that clan. The man told him that it bothered him because the Hebei Peng clan did nothing when the Bloodsnake sect was operating in their territory. Being the owners of the Hebei region, it's unlikely that they didn't know that Blood Serpent existed. If they left them alone even though they knew about them, then there must have been something between them. Hyun replied that he too had heard Yang say something like that. Strange, isn't it? When the Bloodsnake sect was thriving, they didn't blink an eye, but when the Bloodsnake sect fell, they sent their inspection team and tried desperately to cover their tracks. Yang's musings flashed through Unhyun's mind. Mushin asked if Yang Sogol knew that he was responsible for the fall of the Bloodsnake sect. Unhyun replied that given his awareness, it was quite likely. The man went on to ask about his identity. The friend put both hands up in the air, assuming an excited look, and replied that he didn't think anyone would be able to guess about it. Mushin asked if this merchant could be trusted. Up the great green mountains climbed Yang Sogol on Unhyun's errand. His interest and desire to help in the plans of the two soldiers was inexplicable, but it was clear that he too could benefit from what was planned. He paused to catch his breath. He had a long way to go, but the man was not athletic, and the long uphill trek was difficult. He began to tell himself that at such moments he always remembered that it was better to avoid difficult tasks. What was the point of taking that difficult route instead of the rest of the easy ones? He sat down on a rock and began to look at the mountains he would have to walk. He sighed, and a memory flashed before his eyes. Muyung is right. There is an organization of unknown size operating behind our backs, but we have no idea who they are. He must know something, right? Must know to say such things so boldly. He questioned Unhyun in his mind. The guy answered him then that he would explain everything later, so there was no need to turn him down. Master Sung Wol ordered Unhyun to help as much as he could, so he could be trusted. The merchant was greatly surprised that the two warriors were vouched for by Swordmaster Song Wol himself. Now he was thinking about what he had heard, that Swordmaster Song Wol was not as shrewd as before because of his age, but who would dare ignore his orders? As he sat there, 3 brigands approached him. They asked him what he expected when he came to this place, and had the guts to occupy their favorite spot. The merchant grinned, and gathering his things, got up from the rock. He asked the bandits how they were going to make a living as bandits when they were so terrible at knowing people. He was on his way out, and wished them to take care of themselves. But the bandits were not about to let the merchant go, insulted that he was putting himself above them, attacked Yang behind his back, armed with swords. Yang Sogol pulled out the baton that served as his weapon and knocked the 3 villains to the ground, then struck several more blows until the bandits were lying unconscious on the grass. He sighed and began to walk on. His path lay directly to Hebei. Meanwhile, at the Cheon-so Dan camp in one of the superior buildings, Lee Kyung and Do Won were sitting at a table. The commander of the new squad asked the head of the academy how the preparations for the drill were going. Lee Kyung told him that the venue had suddenly changed, and even though they only had a handful of people, it took him a few days to get everything ready. Do Won asked when they would depart. The commander-in-chief replied that the first group was leaving tomorrow morning. The second would be a week later. The first to visit the Hebei Peng clan sect were the main ranks of Cheon-so Dan Academy. Lee Kyung asked in response, "How are the members of Cheon-so Dan doing? Are they still tormented by Master Guan Am?" The 2 comrades continued their conversation over a shot of their favorite alcohol. Meanwhile, Master Guan Am was conducting training. Each day his tasks and battles were getting tougher and more difficult. He stood in front of his students in sleeveless black robes, and he wore special armbands on his hands that made the blows hurt more. Lee Bom swung his sword in his direction, but the blow of the blade blocked the metal armband. The trainer then struck his own blow, but the student dodged, and again the sword struck, crashing into the block with the trainer's arm. The trainer laughed in delight, praising the student for being able to learn and work through his previous mistakes. Wu Young-sab attacked him next. He sneaked up behind him and struck, but the trainer dodged and kicked him. The soldier was able to bounce back into the distance in time. The master remarked that not only some, but in general, each of them practiced their shortcomings well. He added afterward that he would soon become the one to be beaten if he continued to give in. So he suggested increasing the level of difficulty. He activated his inner power and a powerful aura. Mushin was in anticipation of his battle. After training, Guan Am joined his comrades, who had already begun to drink without him. He told them that the boys were growing at an incredible rate. He could hardly handle 2 of them, and he would definitely lose to 3 of them. His comrades responded that it was evident that the master was sweating, which showed that he had had a hard time in the past class. He asked how, with a little extra practice in the evenings, they were able to achieve such success so quickly. He was the teacher, but he wondered that question more than anyone else. One answered that it was entirely the fruit of the master's own labors. The students weren't about to leave the training ground, and decided to practice some more, already without the coach's knowledge. Jang Hyuk honed the art of sword lunges by hitting a special stone that served as a simulator, under Mu Hyun's guidance. The twin replied that it was impossible to get a normal aura, given the state of these swords. The vice commander said that in a real battle he would not have to make excuses. Then he asked the question, what is understood in achieving harmony with a sword? It's just a huge amount of time spent swinging a sword. But in harmony with the sword, the wielder becomes one with the sword, and is also freed from it, and after that one is no longer attached to the sword. Achieving harmony with the sword is also possible with such blunt training, which they were engaged in, so as not to hurt each other and the trainer. Hyun countered, saying that even so, using a sword instead of one that could break at any moment like a branch would be much more comfortable and better. Mushin plucked a branch from the bush, plucked the leaves from it, and swung it across the training stone. No one believed the idea. In that moment, a pleasant memory of the past surfaced before the god of war. 2 men stood before him, leading him to the huge stone. One of them told him that he had bet Huck for a drink that Mushin could cut the stone with a simple twig. He asked his friends which of them had bet on it, and then the comrades, the leaders of sects and cults, replied that they had bet money on both of them that he could do it. It was very boring, for there could be no losers. Why bother with a non-existent bet? He split the rock with ease, and then one of the 3 offered to wager that Mushin couldn't buy them a drink. At this point in reality, the practice rock also fell in 2 halves. All the members of the squad were shocked. This was what it meant to be in harmony with the sword, and yet be free of it. By the end of the day, Seojin was walking along the trail, and she noticed Mu Young talking to his comrade, who was serving in another squad. Yoon Hyun told his friend that if he found out anything else, he would pass it on through Yang. Mushin told him that the fact that Yang So-gol accepted their request meant that he knew something too. There's something suspicious going on in all of this, and he asked Woon Hyun to be careful. His friend promised him to be careful and strong, and then he withdrew to his camp. The man was left standing alone and said aloud, turning to So-jin, that he was already used to her peeping as something commonplace, forcing the girl to stop hiding once more. The girl reported that all the members of the squad were still busy on the training ground, even though night had long since fallen. The aura of the blade used on the branch really stoked their competitive spirit and great motivation. The vice commander replied that it looked like young Cheon Dan would now become even stronger. He asked the girl why she didn't join the general enthusiasm, but So-jin turned the subject around and asked about Yoon Hyun, clarifying if he was serving in Cheon So-dan. Then she asked if their secret dialogue was related to his plans to develop Cheon Soon-dan. The man replied with a non-confirming question that anything was possible. The girl became indignant, asking if he thought he was being rather rude by hiding it from her. If they're going the same way, she should at least know what's going on. Mushin asked her if he should report everything he does to her. She was indignant and replied that he didn't trust her. And he counter-questioned if she trusted him. Was she really willing to trust anyone so easily? They looked into each other's eyes, and then the girl silently lowered her gaze to the ground. Mu Young walked past her, telling her to be patient since everything has its time. But then, So-jin tells him that she trusts him, even though it's not easy. The next morning, Lee Kyung appeared before the first detachment, going to the drill to make a speech. Hebei Peng is the oldest clan in Hebei, and also the most powerful clan in the province. They will learn a lot there, so the soldiers must make the most of their time for this month-long martial arts master training and come back safe and sound. Unhyun's squad headed out on the trek to Hebei Pan. As he exited the gates of the academy, he noticed Mushin standing off to the side near the wall. Their eyes met for a moment, telling each other, as it were, that all would be well as planned. A member of the coalition came to their leader to inform him that the first detachment had just advanced to the Hebei Peng clan. The elder replied that they had done so neither too late nor too early, but at the most opportune moment. The subordinate apologized for his question, and then asked why he had chosen Hebei Pan for the exercise. The most senior elder replied that Hubei and Honam, Sichuan and Qinghai, and even a mountain in Shanxi province. All of these places had already held drills, but not Hebei, so he told them that everyone should go there this time, because if they ignored the clan, it would be very disrespectful to them. Among the mountains, under dark clouds, thick fog, and strong winds, was a city. In one of its headquarters, a man wrapped in a red robe that hid his face was reporting to his master the latest news he had learned. Considering that he is strong enough to earn the rank of vice commander in Yanqiandan, and that he is a hand-to-hand fighter fitting the description, I believe the mysterious man from the coalition. He is the one responsible for what happened to the Bloodsnake sect. Before him on the throne sat his master. It was a man of enormous size with a thick black beard, with a stripped top that covered only the vest over his shoulders, and a large belt buckle at his waist. He asked his spy the man's name. The man answered with the name Mu Yung. The man sipped a little from the bottle, and after saying the name said that his identity was quite curious. The man in the robe continued his report, saying that according to the last report, Cheon So-dan was to go to the Hebei Peng clan this morning for a martial arts training. The master got up from his chair and asked again, "Did they really go to the Hebei Peng clan?" The spy replied that apparently it had been hastily decided on the orders of their leader. The man chuckled, saying that it looked like the old man had beaten them to it, and then ordered them to keep watching young Qiandan and Mu Yung and prepare to leave for Hebei. The agitated spy asked, "Excuse me?" And then the gentleman smacked him on the head and said, "Does a mere shadow dare to challenge his words, Chang Dong himself?" Then the man in the robe stood up and hurried off, saying that he would now take care of all the arrangements. There was no training at Yan Qiandan's camp today. Guanam came to Do One, who was surprised to see him, and then asked what brought him here. The trainer replied that he got an answer from Bi Yundan and Am Yundan. After this news, the commander walked over to the guys who were still doing their personal training and called Mu Yung into his office. On the table in front of them was a map with strategic notes on it. It showed a forest, a river, a house as a headquarters, and 4 mountains, which were signed with names in the form of hieroglyphics and circled in red ink. Between the mountains were trails connected to each other. Do Wan asked the vice commander if he thought they could do it, to which the young man jokingly replied that if he didn't want to, could it be counted as not being able to? Do Wan laughed merrily. After all the explanations by the commander to his right-hand man, he went to report the upcoming task to the entire squad. They were to climb 4 mountains, the Flat Top Mountain, Dabi Mountain, Tiantai Mountain, and Light Mountain. At the top of each mountain there is a flag that is guarded by many well-trained people. The purpose of the training is to go through these people, capture the flags, and return to the coalition. Li Hyuk clarified. Did this mean that all they had to do was get the flags back, no matter how they did it? The task itself sounded simple to everyone. They had been given 10 days for the entire task, and now everyone was wondering, how could they get around 4 mountains in just 10 days? Li Bom said they would have to divide into 4 groups, but even so, the Mountain of Light would be unreachable. Just going there and back at full speed would take 10 days alone. Wu Young-Sob added that they would also have to make it not only the distance, but all the people ready to take away their captured flags on this trek. Mu Young, as the man in charge, came forward with the judicious story that the opponents may have an advantage in numbers, but they cannot block all approaches to the summit. And even if they have set up preventive measures in case they capture flags, most of them must be located near the flag. So the way to the summit shouldn't be difficult, but if it isn't, they will approach the summit. They will all rally to protect the flag. Their main goal is not to prevent Yan Qiandan's squad from reaching the summit, but to keep the flag in place. He will use this as their weakness to capture the flags and return in the 10 days they have. Do Wan got up early in the morning and was greeted by one of the servants cleaning the courtyard. The commander asked him if the others were awake, to which the man replied that the entire group had left 2 hours ago. The commander was surprised, and the members of young Qiandan were already running swiftly through the forest. Baekgon and Li Bom went to the flat-topped mountain, the vice commander called them, and they turned toward the right mountain. Then he called the squad going to Mount Dabi, which included Zhang Hyun and Ha He. Then Ah Young, Zhang Hyuk, and Wu Young Sob went to Mount Light. The last fourth squad went to the farthest mountain of Tian Tai, Mu Young and Han So-jin. The last couple's journey was more like a race. The girl was not going to yield to their leader and kept outrunning him, and after he her, and they ran through the forest in a competitive spirit, expecting each other to be first-rate on this task. On the mountain stood warriors dressed in black robes that hid their faces. On each of their belts were wooden throwing daggers. It was one of the groups young Qiandan was competing against. B. Young Dan and Am Young Dan specialized in ambushes and looked like elite ninjas. A pigeon flew to one of the warriors with a note, from which he learned that the enemies had left 4 hours before the appointed time. Their leader replied that this would not help the enemies in victory. Against them, Am Young Dan, they could not stand. Another of the soldiers ordered everyone to get ready, to defend the flag to the last man, and not let the enemy leave the mountain. Meanwhile, as night fell, Qian So-dan's squad camped for the night, for the journey to the Hebei Peng clan was long and long. They had to get there by noon tomorrow. Yun Hyun noticed a shadow near one of the trees and decided to approach it. His comrades asked where he was going, and then the young man lied that he needed to go to the bushes for a quick pee. He met up with Yan and asked him how it went. The merchant handed the soldier a flare used by the Wanderer faction. He said to point it into the sky and pull the rope. When Un Hyung enters the Hebei Peng clan and fires it, the members of the Wanderer faction in the area will see it and report back to the coalition. Un Hyun praised the merchant, saying that he had come up with something clever. The man replied that the wandering merchants and trading carts that carried goods to the Hebei Peng clan stopped when the Blood Serpent sect fell, but then continued again after a while. There is one wagon that only travels at night. They do not use torches, and it is also accompanied by warriors. The merchant was looking for a chance, and checked the wagon so that no one noticed him. Unfortunately, he could not look inside the crates the wagon was carrying because their lids were carefully nailed shut, but there was a disgusting smell and cold air coming from inside. Yun Hyun was amazed at such a finding, and that the air could have been coming in a cold stream from inside the nailed-up crates. Yang continued by expressing that he supposedly knew what might be inside, but they would need to confirm it. The incoming goods would have to be somewhere in Hebei Peng clan territory, so he wanted Un Hyun to find the boxes and check their contents. The contents of the boxes would determine whether or not he would fire the flare. The young man asked what might be hidden there, but the merchant was silent. Qian So-dan finally came to the territories of a friendly clan. Among the mountains and forests stood a great city, the lands of the greatest clan in Hebei province, and Yan Qiandan's detachment arrived at the flat-topped mountain on the second day of the mission. Baekgon told Li Bom that the mountain's middle name was Rugged Mountain. The second replied that it was a mountain that was completely open, and also the closest, so there might be more people guarding it, just as they predicted. Earlier, the vice commander had said, when laying out the strategy, that they needed men who could break through from the front for this first mountain. So it went to the two most experienced in combat techniques, Li Bom and Baekgon. The two young men themselves wondered if they could withstand a battle with so many people and move on, so they did not hesitate to head to the top of the mountain. The soldiers on the mountain calculated the trajectory of the enemies, who were moving from the south. Why, they figured out 2 victims to the south and east who looked like members of Yan Qiandan. He had heard that there were 9 men in the squad, but it appeared that only 2 had decided to attack. The enemy's tactics were not understood by the ninjas. They mockingly wondered if they really thought they could take the flag away from them with just the two of them. Fleeing deliberately under the view of the soldiers on Mount Baekgong, and Li Bom jumped down, hiding behind the tree crowns. Both targets disappeared from view. One of the commanders metaphorically pronounced that the quickest way to find a frog hiding in the grass was to poke a stick at the intended location. He ordered 3 men to be sent after each target. Small squads went down into the woods where the academy recruits were hiding. Li Bom hid in a tree, hiding behind the branches that were closest to the trunk, while the enemies searched the ground for him. The essence of Mushin's strategy was that the first team, when they almost reached the top, would have to disappear from the eyes of the enemy. And when they went to look for them, the game would begin according to Yan Qiandan's rules. They will have to run to the summit while their opponents chase them. Am Young Dan's units will think they are avoiding them, and will be desperate to prevent them from reaching the summit. Baekgong and Li Bom leapt confidently from tree to tree, fending off enemies' blades and climbing higher and higher toward the summit. Squads of 3 began to pursue them, and the main force of soldiers watching from the mountain could not figure out among the fluttering foliage who was the enemy and who was their ally, so they could not open fire or fire projectiles from above, or in any way block their path to the mountain itself. The trajectories became jumbled and chaotic, making it impossible for Am Yongdan's commander to even determine or guess which side the enemy would attack from. The enemy's view became limited, and by Mu Yong's assumption, which came true, they began to make more unsure decisions that inhibited their reactions, and this created a gap in their defenses. Jang Hyun and Ha He were on their way to Mount Dabi. The young man asked his friend if she knew why this training was so important to him. They were walking along a wooden bridge, and the girl answered irritably, "Why doesn't he just shut up and catch his breath?" Despite their rapid stride, the twin had enough strength and breath to talk during the hike. But realizing that the guy wouldn't let up on her, she still asked why. Chang Hyun replied that he never broke up with Hyuk. They always stuck together no matter what we did. Ha-on asked if he had never done anything without his brother in his whole life. He replied that he had, and that's why this training was important to him. It was his first time, and he wanted to give it his best to prove to himself that he was independent and also selves without his brother. So if one day they couldn't work together, Hyuk wouldn't have to worry about him and could focus on himself. She looked at the boy and replied that he wasn't much different from his brother. She had once heard that twins can feel each other even when they are apart. Then she said that this was why she was sure that if one of them succeeded, the other would follow his example. These words really touched Chan Hyun. Wooden blades flew at Li Bom and Baekgong, but they successfully repelled them and dodged them as they moved further to the top. They managed to jump to the top, and Am Yongdan's entire army surrounded them to prevent them from capturing the flag. Li Bom took on all the soldiers, instantly striking them with his sword, and shouted his comrade's name. Baekgong understood this brief signal and jumped to the wooden pole, cut it down, and grabbed the red cloth of the flag. They managed to capture the flag of the flat-topped mountain. The commander shouted to his subordinates, how could they let them just walk away? Do they really want to be called the worst B. Young Dan squad ever? This provocation worked on the soldiers, and they ran after them. The 2 comrades jumped down the mountain, and the ninjas followed them, throwing a rain of throwing knives in their direction. The commander stayed on the mountain and assessed that the enemy was very good. Baekgong and Li Bom were able to escape, but one of the wooden daggers struck Gong painfully on the leg. The fabric on his pants and boots had rubbed off, and you could see the torn skin on the wound. He began to limp and slow down. He sat down on a rock and told a comrade that he would not be able to run and catch up with Mount Dabi's posse. He asked Li Bom if he could help them alone, but his friend asked in response if he could go back alone. Nodding to each other, the Baek clan heir handed Li Bom the flag, and the latter ran after his comrades from the other squad. The gist of their plan was that once the flag of the flat-topped mountain was captured, the 2 comrades were to head for Mount Light, but they themselves and their squad wanted to split up and each help the squad of both Mount Light and Mount Dabi one by one. However, because of Baekgong's injury, Li Bom was left alone, and he was faced with the choice of which mountain he would go to help his comrades. While he ran to the fork, he began to ponder to make the most appropriate choice. Mount Daby will prove to be the most difficult of all. The mountain is hard to overcome and will require at least 3 men since it is so wide. But nevertheless, the Mountain of Light also requires many men to fight. After capturing the flag, Mu-young told us to head for the Mountain of Light. There were 2 going there, and that, of course, was not enough. After thinking about the vice commander's words, he decided to head to Mount Daby first and try to help them capture the flag as quickly as possible, so that he could all have time to fight together on Mount Light. He now realized that in Mu-young's strategy, there was no backup plan in case he and Baek-gun failed. And strangely enough, none of the 9 men thought there was anything strange about it. But doubting that his vice commander was a bad strategist, he did not, and simply decided that he was only confident of a complete victory for all units, without even considering the possibility of failure. At sunset on Mount Daby, the commander of the squad defending the flag ordered a flare to be lit to let them know that they would be arriving soon. He then told his soldiers that anyone who did not hold their position would be punished with months of hellish training. The rocket was launched into the air and lit up the sky. Jang Hyun and Ha Hee were not far near the mountain when they noticed fire in the sky. Night fell, and Mu-young and So-jin stopped to rest. She asked the young man how he knew Un-hyung, but the man snapped back, asking how the girl got the strength to talk. He said she wouldn't be resting for long, so it would be better for her to be quiet and use the time to her advantage. The girl was hurt by this attitude. Could a little chit-chat really take so much energy? But Mushin smiled and began to tell the story. I met him in a loggia near Hebei. At the time, there was a member of the Blood Serpent there rolling up a scandal, and I knocked him out. And then the owner of the cabin warned me in fear that trouble always follows you when you meddle in blood snake affairs. So I went to the headquarters of the Blood Snake to take care of everything. And then one of the men in the hut went with me saying he wanted to help me. That was Yoon Hyun. That's how I met him, and we became friends. And because of him I joined the coalition, said the god of war. The girl replied that she had heard that the Blood Snake sect had been mysteriously erased. Does he mean to say that he and Yoon Hyun were the ones responsible for it? But Mu-young replied again that they should be quiet and take a breather, so that they would have the strength to move on with their journey. It wasn't until the next morning that Lee Bom was able to get there. He found Ha-on in the forest, sitting with a red flag in her hands. When the girl saw the young man, her legs trembled and she began to slide off the rock, almost fainting. Lee Bum managed to grab and pick her up in his arms and began to ask where Yang Hyun was and what happened to herself. The girl looked very tired, and her skin was all riddled with small and large abrasions. She said that Hyun had stayed on the battlefield, letting her escape with the flag, and should now be on the mountainside. She then asked where her brother was, and Lee Bom replied that he was wounded, so he went back to the coalition. She grabbed her comrade's weak hand by the fabric of his garment and asked him to find Master Chan Hyuk and not to return without him. He answered her not to worry and ran to find his friend. In the girl's mind, she still kept saying that this training was very important to her partner, and he must surely succeed. And then she told herself how strange it was that she felt excitement for someone she had never felt before. Mu-young and Han So-jin reached Mount Tiantai. The name of the mountain meant mountain in the sky, and this high ground was covered in mist, making it seem as if the mountain was really that high, and as if it were covered by thick clouds. The vice commander said that as soon as they got the flag, the girl should go back to the coalition and check out Mount Daby on the way. So-jin protested as she thought the flat-topped mountain team would help Mount Daby, and the 2 of them would head toward Mount Light. Mushin replied that his alone would be enough as an aid to Mount Light, but he wasn't sure about Mount Daby. The girl began to complain that it was just a training session, so why should it be taken so seriously? She didn't like it, so she said she would go to Mount Light with him. The vice commander replied that this training may have been meaningless to the girl, but it was very important to young Cheon-dan, so he believed that she would definitely make it. The girl blushed at the praise for having so much faith in her, and then Mu-young said that it was so easy for her to trust others. But So-jin found something to say and said that he must be different than he was then, since he trusted others so easily. The man smiled as he looked at the back of his friend. who began to step ahead so that her comrade could not see her blush. Walking through the forest were 2 soldiers from B. Young Dan's and Am Young Dan's units, who appeared to be serving as messengers. They were discussing among themselves that the flat-topped mountain and Mount Davy had already lost their flags. To think. Mount Davy had lost its flag at dawn. Only 2 soldiers had been sent there from Yongcheon-dan, one of whom was a woman. Then they told each other that if they also lost their flag, they would be seriously embarrassed. Among the trees on a rock sat another warrior dressed in the same black uniform as the 2 soldiers. He was sitting with his back to them, and without seeing his face, they thought it was someone from their squad, and asked what he was doing here when they were about to be attacked by the enemy. They were supposed to be patrolling in groups of 2, and could not understand why this man was not carrying out his assigned task. He threw several mental daggers in their direction, and those daggers fiddled with the bodies of his victims, hitting them square in the heart. Blood poured from the mouths of the unfortunates, and they died instantly. The groups defending the flag all had only wooden daggers, which they had to use to bruise their enemies. But the members of Yongcheon-dan themselves were armed with real swords, so they could cut the projectiles flying at them as well, so they could cut off the flag and use a sharp blade so as not to kill any of their opponents. It was primarily a training and a test for them, and included many factors and subtleties of swordsmanship and other skills. However, no one expected a spy, pretending to be a member of one of the groups guarding the flag, and killing his comrades and enemies with real throwing knives, to be on the grounds. He looked at the 2 corpses and said that they were out of luck, since his only target was Mu Young. So Jin and Mu Young were moving toward the mountain, and between the trees the duty groups were watching their trajectory. One of the groups fired a red flare into the sky so that the squads from the summit could see where the enemies were now. They were coming from the south ridge. They needed to tell all the other teams on duty where to go, so they launched a green signal from the mountain, which was from the south side, and everyone knew to move toward the south ridge. The 2 partners sensed that the enemy already knew they were coming. At that moment, the mysterious spy pulled his blades from the corpses and wiped away the blood. He laughed and began to walk in the direction where Mushin was advancing too. The soldiers who came began to throw ebonite balls at Mu Young and So Jin, which were too painful to hit their bodies. They jumped from tree to tree and ran away from the projectiles, but at one point too many balls started flying at them, and then So Jin covered her partner with her body and with a couple of light sword strokes shattered all the balls, and then flew over the heads of the soldiers, from which the soldiers were very surprised. They were amazed at their level, and did not even believe at first that they were ordinary people. The enemies were fast and strong, and definitely professionals. So thought the members of the group defending the flag. Mushin asked his partner to save her strength for Mount Davy, but the girl replied that she knew exactly what she was doing. At that moment, another group of soldiers attacked them from the treetops, pointing ebonite balls from the sky in their direction to hit them on the head. Mu Young noticed this, and pulled the girl by the scruff of her clothes to make her fly away from the projectiles. They were able to dodge successfully. The units running overhead shouted to each other that the enemies were passing over the ridges and approaching the mountainside. They had to be stopped immediately. A rain of balloons began to fly in their direction, hitting the tree trunks. Mu Young and So Jin dodged this rain and then escaped the attack by jumping down to the slope. An abyss stood before them, separating them from the very top of the mountain. As it turned out, the mountain, standing on ridges, had a slope down into the chasm before its highest point. The girl told the vice commander that he appeared to have come in the wrong direction because of the fog. The enemies lined up behind them, creating a living wall that blocked the path of retreat. Their commander said there was a very steep descent ahead, with a 50-step gap. They had nowhere to retreat to. But Mushin smiled slyly. The troops lined up in a detachment demanded that the 2 warriors surrender. Their commander threatened that if the members of Yongcheon-dan resisted, they would beat them to a pulp and send them back in a wagon. Mushin replied to them that there would be no surrender or struggle. He and So Jin were going to cross the chasm and reach the top of the mountain. But the girl protested when she heard what the vice commander said. He told him that the opponents had said that the chasm was 50 paces, but the limit of her jump was only 25. Mu Young told her that even that limit would be enough. He shouted to the troops to surrender to them. Considering the distance separating the opponents, they were much closer to the flag, and that distance would increase even more once he and So Jin jumped over the chasm, and then they would no longer be able to catch up with them. He led the girl to the precipice. She thought he was crazy. How could they jump into the abyss? The troop commander told them in pursuit that he wasn't bluffing, and it really wasn't a distance they could jump. Their strategy for protecting the flag was to place it on the summit many days in advance, safely down the slope and then up, and now there was no one in flag territory itself, for they were sure it was out of reach. Their opponents, however, were the real madmen. Mu Young asked the girl to trust him, and just jump as hard as she could. The girl screamed that it wouldn't help, no matter how much she trusted him. The commander started yelling at his subordinates. Do they really want to rake their corpses off the ground afterwards and answer responsibly to Commander-in-Chief Young Cheon-dan? And then the soldiers ran to the cliff to stop their enemies. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, and when the guy told her to jump, she pushed off the ground with all her might. He told her to open her eyes and look at the point where they should land. She already felt her jump limit was ready and they were mid-distance, but she noticed that Mushin was holding her tightly by the waist and carrying her behind him with his own far-jumping strength. He landed on his feet, throwing the girl to the ground. They did it. It was just a matter of little else. Now So Jin had to go up for the flag and head for Mount Daby. They looked to the other side of the chasm, near where all the soldiers were standing, and the commander-in-chief was shouting at them to move faster toward the top. But they were not so strong and brave as to jump after their opponents over the chasm, and they had to go around. But Mu Young did not relax and asked her friend to speed up, or else they would be chased very soon. There were very few soldiers standing near the flag. Mushin took over, shredding all their smelling ebonite balls, and So Jin cut off the wooden pole and seized the flag. He rolled the red cloth in a roll and fastened it to his belt. It was time to say goodbye to her partner, agreeing to see each other back at the Murim coalition. Finally, Mu Young told the girl that they would barely make it back to the coalition in time if she reached Mount Daby today. He asked her to hurry, and as she began to leave, he asked him to be careful, even if he didn't need such admonition. He headed in the opposite direction to get from Mount Tiantai to Mount Light. As he was descending from the summit through the forest, he suddenly stopped abruptly, sensing someone's sinister aura in the mist. An unpleasant laugh was heard behind the trees. A man's voice said that he had been declassified. He tried very hard to suppress within himself the urge for bloodshed and murder, but no matter how hard he tried, Mu Young could still feel it. The vice commander asked who was standing in front of him. The man smiled wickedly, and then Mushin demanded even louder that the stranger introduce himself. The man replied that it didn't matter who he was. It was more important who was standing in front of him. He turned to Mushin, calling him Deputy Commander Young Cheon-dan, Mu Young. This meant that he had come just for him and knew quite a bit of information about his intended target. He had wanted to meet Mu Young for a long time. He threw one of his daggers in his direction, which flew past the soldier's face and cut part of his hair. The long hair was now shoulder length. The blade slammed into the tree behind him, which instantly burst into small chips. Mushin continued to stand silently in place, glaring at his enemy with a stern gaze. The stranger replied that he was already embarrassing him with one such greeting, for he didn't even flinch, let alone blink an eye. Mu Young started to move towards him, and then the man told him that he really must have the kind of courage that radiated from his appearance. Otherwise, it wouldn't be any fun at all. The fog thickened near Mushin, and the wind increased, fluttering green leaves on the sides as if before a thunderstorm. He could not see his opponent, but at that moment a dagger flew near his face again, and he barely managed to dodge it. The spy swept overhead over his head and threw two blades at him again, aiming for his eyes. The mist surrounded Mushin, and the man jumped back, unable to see if he was hit as he intended. But suddenly, from the dense white cloud, his own blade flew toward him and broke a tree near him. He hid behind another tree and shouted to his enemy that he knew how to paddle, though he lacked skill. He looked out from behind the tree and saw that the fog had cleared, and Mu Young was not there. Suddenly he was right in front of him, giving the spy a swipe. But he blocked the blow with his wrists and flew sideways and crashed into a tree. The vice commander grabbed the rogue by the throat and lifted him above the ground. He said that nothing on this man, other than what he was wearing, indicated that he was from Zhongyuan. He was not from there, and had only pretended to be part of the army by disguising himself in their black uniforms. The man smiled and pulled another dagger from his sleeve, intending to strike his enemy on the head, but he dodged and he could only cut off the rest of his long hair. Then he made another lunge. Then Mushin struck him in the wrist and then in the stomach. The spy flew into a tree and the trunk flew with him further, falling to pieces from such powerful force. Some of the trees broke in this fight. Spyro rose to his feet and replied that Mu Young was better than he thought. His face became frantic. A stream of blood flowed from his mouth and his white eyes with black circles resembled a madman or a man possessed. He told him that the vice commander could hit him, but that wasn't enough to kill him. The stranger stood in front of Mushin and said that he thought that the snot-nosed young Danes had probably already found the bodies of their comrades. Mu Young called him a murderer, but the man replied that he had to, otherwise they wouldn't have met. Afterwards, the man said that he had to leave before the members of Bi Yundan's squad came running at him. Unfortunately, he had no more time. Mushin decided to attack him one last time, saying that he would not let him go. But the enemy pulled out a lit bomb and let loose a smoke screen of red. He slipped away from the god of war in the red smoke, flashing his mad eyes one last time and shouting that they would meet again. But then he would no longer be alone, but with his fellows. The fog cleared and there was no one else in the forest. The young practitioner went on his way to the Mountain of Light. Having undergone a complete transformation and absolute restoration, I was reborn in a new, younger body. In doing so, I retained all the memories I had 2 decades ago. And you made 2 mistakes. One, you did not know my true identity. The second is that you revealed that you had infiltrated Zhongyuan. He turned in his thoughts to his new enemy, remembering his goal of getting revenge on everyone who deserved it, and when he had stabbed him in the back in a past life. He was sure that this mad spy belonged to one of the enemy organizations whose elimination was one of his goals. And from these 2 mistakes by which the man gave himself away, he wasn't too hard to spot. So Vice Commander Young Qian-dan decided, after finishing his training, to start an investigation about this mysterious agent. Mu Young became enthusiastic and along the way was smashing rocks, bragging to himself that let anyone try to cross him, and then he would defeat absolutely everyone and destroy everyone. The spy was hiding in a cave, bleeding. He sat down on the ground and began to regain his exhausted spiritual powers to heal his body. His eyes still glowed white, with a red-pink negative ominous aura. He is incredibly skilled and powerful despite his age. I didn't believe that he single-handedly destroyed the Blood Serpent sect. If there was some purpose behind his actions, and joining the coalition is part of it, he could prove to be a serious liability to the organization. We need to get rid of him as soon as possible. He pondered in his thoughts. The day passed and night came, and Jung ran, hoping for help, with the flag in her hands. Not far from Mount Light there is a little town called Yonam. Mu Young told them that when each of them, after attacking the right mountain, whether they get the flag or not, they will first have to come to that town to meet him, and then head to the coalition. At this house they would have to wait for him until midnight of the 6th day. And Yong ran to this town, looking for the vice commander to ask for help. When they attacked Mount Dabi, Jang Hyuk and Woo Young Sob were surrounded. The girl wanted to help them, but they shouted at her not to worry about them and run away with the flag or they would all be caught, and it would be a failure for the whole team. The girl promised them she would return with Mu Young and save them. She stood in front of the slope going down into the town to catch her breath, but suddenly she heard someone sneaking up on her in the dark. Reflexively, she threw a string toward the sound, but it turned out to be the deputy commander, who deftly caught her fishing line and wound it around his fist. Mushin said the girl was late, and she fell helplessly to her knees, glad to see him. She did not recognize her comrade because of the new length of hair she had received in battle. She then revealed that Yang Hyuk and Woo Young Sob were being held captive by the enemy. They gave her a chance to escape, but she doesn't know what ended up happening to them. The deputy commander asked the girl to turn her back to him to replenish her energy, after which she would have to return to the coalition with the flag. The girl resisted, saying that she would go with him to save her comrades since she had promised them. But he told her that she had already done enough, and now it was more important to get all the flags on time, and he could save his friends alone. The girl didn't argue anymore. He asked her to relax and regain her breathing rhythm. He ran his hand down her back, bringing order to the internal energy flows that had been disrupted by great excitement and a difficult battle. The girl calmed down completely and her strength returned to her. It would take at least 5 days to reach the coalition from the Mountain of Light, and today was the 6th day. This was the talk of the warriors of the flag-defending detachment who held Jang Hyuk and Woo Young-sab in their captivity. They were lying unconscious on the ground, tied up with ropes. One of the soldiers told the sleeping men that no one had come back for them, which meant that their own comrades had abandoned them. Afterward, he added to his squad members that there was no need for the intoxicating sleep drug, because even if they were conscious and escaped, they wouldn't have enough time to reach the coalition in the appointed time. Plus, they were in poor physical condition, and even if they were cured, even healed, they would not have enough time. They wondered if they should give the captives an antidote and let them go. Suddenly there was a man moving toward them at high speed. They began to watch to see who was heading for the top of their mountain. From the looks of it, it wasn't the girl who had captured the flag. It was a man. Everyone was shocked by his running speed and began to worry about what they would do when he came up to them. The commander ordered everyone to get their swords ready, and at that moment Mu Young jumped high and landed on their platform. The commander ordered them to grab him. Everyone pounced on the young warrior with their wooden swords, but he easily began to flip everyone away with his fists without much effort. In a short amount of time, the entire army of Mount Light was already on the ground. He approached the commander and asked if he would allow him to take his soldiers. Meanwhile, at the Murim Coalition headquarters, Do-won asked Baek Gong if his ankle was okay. The young man replied that it was fine and that his leg no longer hurt. On the table in the courtyard was a roll of the first flag. Only one so far came back with the flag. Today was the last 10th day of the mission, and the two of them awaited the return of the entire group. One of the servants asked the commander to pay attention to the entrance to the gate. He looked there and saw the remaining members of young Cheon-dan entering. Ahead of them all was Ha-on, holding the flag in her hand, with Jang Hyun and Lee Bom walking beside her. Behind them with the flag walked So-jin. The soldiers bowed to the commander, reporting that they had delivered the flags of Daebi Mountain and Tiantai Mountain. Do-won asked them to communicate without formality, for they were already overly tired. He placed 2 more flags on the table and asked the servants to escort the soldiers to the rest area and bring them drinks and food. They were ordered to rest properly. Baek Gon approached his sister and they embraced, praising each other. His brother was very proud of his sisters, who had endured the mission much longer than he had. However, the younger sister was still missing. Jang Hyun asked where his brother was, but Baek Gon replied that the Mount of Light team and vice commander had not yet returned. The day passed and everything was nearing sunset, signaling the end of the 10th and final day of the mission. Merchant Yang came to the gates of the coalition and asked the guards if everyone from Yan Cheon-dan had gone back. The guards replied that the guy with the injured ankle was back 3 days ago, and that only 4 had arrived this morning. Yan then asked if their commander was back, but the answer was no. He had business with Mu Young, so he stayed to wait for him. So Jin walked past them, asking to be let through. The guards asked if she intended to go far, to which the girl replied that she was going to greet her comrades, who would return soon. The mean guard said they'd better get back soon, though he wasn't betting much money on the return, but he didn't want to lose the bet he'd made with his friends. Merchant Yang looked gloomily in So-jin's direction, either scheming something or suspecting her of something. Immediately after the fall of the Sinner faction in the Great Battle of Murim, word gradually spread that the Magyo and their leader, Dan Gak, were to blame. But the Magyo were one step ahead, and they used the remaining lineage of Dan Gak and his associates as scapegoats. They lost their entire fortune. The men were beheaded and the women were tortured. And while it hasn't been confirmed yet, apparently Dan Gak's daughter has hidden her identity and gone over to our side. Yang pondered as he looked at So-jin with a hard gaze. Her fiery red eyes and aura, noticed only for a moment, were as cold and sharp as a razor. Her swordsmanship led him to believe that she might be the girl. Could it have been right under their noses? At this time, familiar silhouettes appeared on the horizon. She saw Mu Young and ran to meet him. The merchant told the guard that he had to put more money on it. The 4 remaining members of the squad arrived before midnight, the end of the 10th day. All 4 flags were on the table, and they successfully completed the task. Do-Won praised the entire team and told his deputy that he continued to exceed all his expectations. Young Qian-dan's notoriety will undoubtedly grow after this training, all thanks to their brilliant planning and effort. Mu Young replied that although it was all true that he had given everything to succeed, there was no guarantee as to what would happen. It was only possible because of a concerted effort and teamwork. Young Qian-dan, who had achieved their first success, decided to throw a real feast. They sat in the common room of the dormitory and sat around a communal table, drinking delicious drinks and sampling various treats. They shared various experiences with each other, but it was the Chan twins who talked the most. Chang Hyun said that he had rushed like the wind to get away from his enemies, and had taunted them so much that he thought he would actually die if they caught him. And though he was out of breath, he couldn't stop, so he thought for sure he would die. And just when he thought he couldn't escape anymore, Lee Bum showed up. At that moment, Hyun felt that he had finally met the love of his life. Everyone laughed from the emotional and brightly gesticulated story of the twin, who led Lee Bum astounded with his joke. Mu Young stood on the balcony, not sharing in the general joy and laughter. Han So-jin came up to him and said that she couldn't get away from the idea that something happened up there on the mountain after she left, not looking at her comrade's hair already, who never told him who was able to cut it off, because everyone knew it was almost impossible to get that close to him. He asked her why she was not at the general celebration. The girl replied that she wasn't used to festive feasts and such. The man said that even though it was just a training session, it was still a meaningful event. It was their first victory. It is on occasions like this that the bond with comrades is strengthened. She asked him back, "What about him?" He replied that it was important to draw the line between the elite and the dregs. The girl was about to be outraged, but he said in time that it was a joke. So-jin sarcastically said that she didn't think he knew how to joke. Suddenly Mushin saw John, the merchant, down the street, and told the girl he would be right back. The 2 men went into the gazebo, hidden from prying eyes, and the vice commander asked his spy how it went. He put his finger to his lips, asking for silence. He sensed that Han So-jin was watching him. It was indeed so. She was hiding behind the trees. Mu Young could sense her too. The traitor asked if she could be trusted, to which the young man replied that she would not ruin their plan. Yang So-gol laughed, saying that Mu Young knew how to play with her words. Whether he trusted her or tamed her didn't matter, nor did she herself, as long as the deputy commander was able to control her. Mushin was about to leave, for he wasn't about to waste time on pointless conversations. But then the merchant abruptly blurted out the gist of their meeting. The signal was given last night. Hyun gave a signal that meant something had happened to the Hebei Peng clan. There were several instances where the Hebei Peng clan supported the Blood Serpent sect, but that was not enough to claim that they were related. This shows how carefully Hebei Peng clan covered its tracks. So I looked elsewhere, and the boxes being smuggled to their base caught my attention. Since I had no excuse for breaking into their domain, I asked Hyun to find and check their contents, and if he fired a flare, that means he found something terrible, Yang So-gol told me. Hyun had indeed found a terrifying thing. While his comrades were practicing and warming up, he slowly got out of their sight, and then, climbing up the stairs, he infiltrated the warehouse and saw whole racks built of wooden crates stacked on top of each other. There were a lot of them, and a stinky, sweet smell and coldness emanated from all of them. Yang went on to add that everything meant that this could be a much bigger problem than the relationship between the Peng clan and the Blood Serpent sect. In these boarded-up crates lay corpses. What the Hebei Peng clan needed them for is unknown. Mushin asked Yang So-gol not to tell anyone about this, but the traitor replied that he wasn't sure if he would honor that request. If this organization, which he checked at Mu Young's request, is using corpses, It is not something he can keep quiet about. Mushin replied that he was aware of this, and therefore asked him not to tell anyone yet and to be discreet. The deputy commander asked the merchant to keep this news to himself for 1 week, or at least a few days. They parted, and Mu-young found So-jin among the trees. They walked back to their camp, discussing what was happening in passing as the girl heard every word. She asked her partner about whether he wanted to leave without warning the commander. It was obvious that she would follow whatever choice he made. He answered her that moving in large groups was too slow and obvious, so they might miss the chance they were given. The girl said that nevertheless, the greatest in Hebei were the Peng clan. They had to report it to their superiors to find some excuse. This was not a place they could just break into just because they found a few bodies. Mushin reminded her if the girl remembered that he had asked her to prepare properly. The girl remembered him telling her earlier that everything she would experience by joining him would be incredibly difficult to endure. She really did not understand or realize the enormity of her leader's hidden plan, and that its execution would be so risky. He said that if she wanted to find the answer to her own question, her answer was there ahead. The image of her mentor Song-wol appeared before her eyes, telling her that she would find the answer if she followed Mu-young. And then the unnecessary bickering fell away, and she trusted his actions completely, despite the effect it might have on their careers at Young Cheondan. He asked her if she trusted him, to go back to her room and change, taking only her sword with her. The spy who attacked Mushin on Mount Tiantai came to report to his leader. He wore a red cloak and came to a spacious platform that stood as if amid smoke or mist. A man stood at a distance from him on an elevated platform. Around him, staves were thrust into the stone floor, from which streams of smoke flowed. The spy knelt before him and introduced himself by the name Ha. He had come to make a request of the Lord. But the man, also dressed in a red cloak, and with a tall hairdo in which his hair was attached to an oblong, narrow cylinder, answered him to return to his post. He was under no obligation to give an audience to someone like him. Ha, despite his refusal, continued his report, telling them that a few days ago he had personally fought Mu-young, the man responsible for the downfall of the Blood Snake sect. He turned out to be stronger than they thought, and could be a great obstacle in their way. Therefore, he would like to ask permission to send his assassination team and get rid of Mu-young. The man on the platform replied that they had all been ordered to keep their heads down and to stay out of the coalition's sight. However, Ha didn't listen and left traces of their organization's existence, not to mention the fact that he failed to kill Mu-young. And after all that, he has the nerve to ask for forgiveness. The subordinate said he wasn't asking for forgiveness and was only acting for their safety. The man wouldn't listen to him anymore, and showing one index finger as a warning, silently ordered the executioner, who was behind the offender's back, to do his job. The red-eyed warrior, with his face covered by a cloth, swung a small scythe and cut the unfortunate man's neck. After the executioner carried the body away and cleaned up the blood, the man with the tall hairdo climbed the stairs on the stone mountain that served as the tower and throne of the lord who ran the organization. The speaker said that although the coalition was up to something, there was no movement there except for Cheon So-dan, who was training. Afterwards, he reported to his master that they had news that Yang Dong had gone to the Peng residence. He seemed to have gone there in case something happened. He asked the leader, what should they do now or not? Between two burning torches with red hole flags hanging from their rods, a gray-haired old man sat on a small ladder, his back to the man. His snow-white hair was long and ran down the steps along with his cloak. The enigmatic sage replied that they should show them if they pointed their swords at them, they would suffer far greater losses. He ordered them to pass it on to Chang Dong, and if it didn't work out, they would have to kill everything breathing in the Peng residence and burn it to the ground. An eagle flew toward the Peng clan's territory, gliding toward the forest where members of the enemy organization, clad in red cloaks, were hiding. They took notes from the bird that contained the latest news and their leader's decision. One of the commanders ordered a team of assassins to be prepared within half a day's journey of Pan's residence. The subordinate bowed and went to make all the preparations. The commander-in-chief set fire to the note, and while it burned, said the one who shook his hand, and the one who tried to break free of the grip. This would set a good example for both of them. At young Cheon Dan's camp in the early morning hours, Commander Do-won was informed that his deputy, Mu-young, was missing. His clothes were still there, but they had seen him the previous night, but no one had seen him since. Ah-young came out of the girls' rooms and said that Han So-jin was also missing. Her clothes were there, but her sword was gone. They decided to conduct a search of the grounds, hoping that maybe they were just training somewhere. Lee Bom reported to Do-won that they had searched almost everywhere in the coalition, but they were nowhere to be found, and no one had seen them. There is also no record of them leaving through the main gate. One of the servants ran out of Mu-young's chambers with a note in his hand and handed it to the commander. Do-won summoned Lee Kyung for a talk and informed him of the missing 2 soldiers. The leader asked if they had become arrogant just because they had succeeded in training. Did that mean they had deserted? Do-won replied that he and his squad assumed that's exactly what they had done, given the circumstances. But that wasn't the problem. They found a note in Mu-young's room with only the name Hebei Peng Clan. Apparently that's where the 2 traitors were headed, but Do-won had no idea what Mu-young was thinking. Lee Kyung said that he had just received an order from the leader to go to the Hebei Peng Clan. He wasn't mentioned any details, but he was told that he had to go. The coalition's radii. Do-won asked when the commander-in-chief would go. Meanwhile, in the night, Mu-young and Han So-jin were running across the field at all speeds. The girl began to breathe rapidly, but didn't give any sign that she was tired. Mushin stopped, offering the girl some rest. She bent over to catch her breath, then sat down on a rock and fell asleep. The man smiled, thinking of her pride, for in fact she was very tired. He looked at her and thought about how the reason she was climbing into the lion's den might be because 20 years ago he had failed to end it all. Before Mushin's eyes appeared a picture of his last battle in a past life. He was fighting a man in a red cloak. He struck him, but he repulsed it with his elbow, and then swung another fist while his opponent was about to strike him with his hand technique. And in an instant they were simultaneously thrown away from each other, and debris of stones and drops of blood flew in the space around them. At dawn, the vice commander awakened So-jin, and she asked in horror how long she had slept. He reassured her that he too needed to rest. It was time for them to go. He gave the girl a hand, and they set off again. Meanwhile, at the Hebei Peng clan's residence, Eun-hyung was training with his new temporary sword teacher. The trainer told him that he had already become envious of his brilliant swordsmanship, and then called him Cheon-song. Apparently, when registering with the Hebei Peng sect, the coalition ordered them to give their fake names, which meant that having students there was unsafe and did not inspire confidence. Because if Eun-hyun alone had given his name incorrectly, his comrades would have turned him in. The whole thing was strange. Eun-hyun bowed to the teacher and said that he was flattering him. The trainer's name was Squire Peng Woo-young. Peng Woo-yoon was walking around the garden and talking to Eun-hyun, who had shown the best of his squad. He talked about how he thought training would go badly because of the lack of preparation, given that the leader had changed plans at the last minute. But his burden was lifted after seeing Cheon-song train. Eun-hyun replied that he was flattered, and then added that he changed his mind about returning to the coalition after seeing the hospitality of the Hebei Peng clan. The squire laughed cheerfully and replied that this was indeed the case. The sword style of the Peng clan is so majestic and ruthless that it made a lasting impression on Cheon-song. Eun-hyun tried his best to suck up to the head of the clan to favor his persona, for his and Mu-young's plan. Squire Peng Woo-young replied to him that he already has a sword style, but he talks as if he wants to learn the Peng clan style. Their clan style is based on a person's character, and it is extremely difficult to do so for those who did not grow up in these lands. Eun-hyun asked the head if he could introduce him to some of the clan members to see how character traits can shape sword-wielding strength, and how those students who grew up here are special and different, and how they differ from him. Woo-yun replied that this technique was very damaging even to the natural-born bearers, and this was exemplified by his own brother, who was all too eager to become the best warrior in history, and he was not ashamed of it no matter what. One of the leader's aides commented that it could be harmful to talk about personal and matters within the clan to outsiders. The man looked at his subordinate grimly and said that in spite of his actions, the one he was talking about was still his proud brother and a noble man. The squire trusted the pleasant young man and resolved to escort him to their dungeon and give him a tour there. They went down to the dungeon, where Peng Wu-yun began to tell him that because of the rude nature of the clan warriors, small conflicts and disputes were quite common. This underground prison was meant for such hotheads. Un-hyun said that he had never before seen such a prison within a martial arts training camp. It was a spacious dungeon with strong and secure cells for the prisoners. But he wondered why Leader Pan had brought him here. The leader went on to say that, unfortunately, his brother was here as well. In one of the cells, chained to the ground, sat a half-naked, gaunt, middle-aged man with long, disheveled hair and a beard. He was the man who had come to be known as the Ferocious Blade, after killing countless opponents in the Great Battle of Murim. It was the brother of the head of the clan, Peng Do-cheon. Yun-hyun wondered how such a great man could end up like this. The man replied that too much could be detrimental to a man's spirit, especially his emotional factor. Do-cheon was not satisfied with just Hebei and sought to take over the entire Zhongyuan, so he began to train all day long. He severed ties with everyone, including family members, and trained until his body began to deteriorate. They tried the whole clan to stop him, but his brother's determination was unbreakable, and no matter how hard they tried, it never waned. After all, he had been struck by cultic hysteria after excessive training, and now he always is. At this point, the prisoner rose and began to call his brother by name. He whispered that he could hear Wu Yun's voice and then screamed that he would kill him. His eyes were mad, and he saw his own brother as nothing but an enemy, and he also thirsted for blood. He jerked forward, but the shackles held him back, and he returned to his seat. Peng Wu-yun led the frightened apprentice away from the place, and said that such a decision to imprison him was necessary for the safety of the clan. Hun-hyun expressed his condolences to the squire, but he said that he didn't need pity and was only showing him this so that he could understand how damaging their clan's machinery could be to his brain. So let the apprentice just enjoy a month's camp within their walls and make the most of his stay. As they walked up the corridor above to the surface, the young man could hear Peng Do-cheon's voice echoing against the walls in total silence. He spoke only 2 words, bloodlust, without stopping. And then he said an extended phrase, saying that he felt the power of blood, and that it had to be stopped immediately. On the surface, the apprentice promised that he would not tell anyone about Peng Do-cheon, because he was sure that there would be people who would want to tarnish his reputation if they found out about his situation, which had been kept secret. He thanked his mentor for trusting him. Mr. Peng replied that he expected no less nobility from a disciple of Swordmaster Song-will. Un-hyun bowed and said he would go to finish his training with his companions. The squire's right-hand man reported to him that while they were in prison, a message arrived at the residence expecting new guests. Meanwhile, Yun-hyun was walking along the path and could not get the prisoner's words about the power of blood out of his mind. It was as if he knew what was going on in his native lands, as if he knew that there were corpses stored in the storeroom for obscure purposes, and that enemies and a sinister aura were pressing in from all sides and waiting for the right moment to attack. Li Kyung and his subordinates were already approaching Hebei Peng, but even faster there was Mu Young with Han So-jin to find justice and to neutralize the evil forces that have taken root within the ancient and great Peng clan. Could it be that Peng Do-cheon foresaw that a great deal of blood would soon be spilled?